Did you know that more than 90% of viewers don't subscribe to our channel? If you're watching this and haven't subscribed yet, please consider hitting that subscribe button. We don't run ads on our videos, so we don't earn anything from them. Every subscription, every like, every comment truly means the world to us. Your support keeps our passion alive and motivates us to create more. We'd also love to hear from you. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Let's start our story.
Story number 1. The night had folded itself over the interstate like a heavy wool blanket by the time Daniel Kerrigan rolled his rig onto the long, lonely stretch locals called the Miller Line. Out here, between two small towns that each claimed to be the last light before nowhere, the road ran arrow straight through a basin of low, marshy ground and tangled pines. To dispatch, it was just another line on a digital map. To drivers, it was the place where the fog came down from the hills and swallowed sound. The dashboard of his truck glowed a soft, electronic amber, the gauges rising and falling in lazy, familiar rhythms. The hum of the diesel was a constant undercurrent, a mechanical heartbeat he had lived by for 20 years. Thermos coffee steamed faintly in the cup holder, carrying that stale, comforting smell of burnt beans and powdered creamer. Somewhere in the back, inside the dark of the sleeper cab, bungee cords creaked occasionally as the refrigerated trailer shifted its tiny weight with every seam in the pavement. Daniel rolled his shoulders, felt vertebrae click, and shook his head once to keep the veil of sleep from settling over his eyes. He'd been on the road since late afternoon, and the monotony of the interstate, the measured passing of reflective posts, the endless unfurling of white lane lines, had started to work its slow magic. He flicked his eyes to the digital clock set into the dash. 1:13 a.m. Outside, the world was hardly a world at all, just a narrow tunnel of high beams and a faint ribbon of horizon. The sky was a low, moonless lid, clouds hanging heavy and close, like a ceiling that had been lowered without him noticing. The radio was turned low, murmuring the end of some country song about a man who'd left and wished he hadn't. Static licked at the edges of the singer's voice. On the CB, channels that had been lively earlier in the evening had gone quiet. Every so often, a distant voice murmured a mile marker or a weather warning, but mostly there was only the soft hiss of open air, millions of tiny particles colliding in invisible static. He knew the stories truckers told about this stretch of highway, that the fog here was different, that sometimes when it got thick enough, it changed how time moved, that drivers had lost hours or gained them, or seen parts of their own routes replay like an old film. It was the kind of talk that grew up anywhere humans spent long, sleepless hours in the dark, where imagination slipped its leash. Daniel didn't consider himself a superstitious man. He did, however, respect the fog. He, once driven into a bank of it too fast, and almost kissed the back of a slow-moving van he'd never seen, until it filled his windshield. It had taken a long, quiet pull into a rest area afterward before his hands stopped shaking. Up ahead, the road sign announcing Miller County Line flashed by in the beams, its green face slick with moisture. Beneath it, someone had spray-painted a crude white skull with fog rolling from its eyes. The paint dripped from the edges, long since softened by rain. Daniel watched it slip into his mirrors, then fade. He reached for the CB mic out of habit, his fingers curling around its battered plastic shell. "Any of you boys out here on the Miller tonight?" he asked, voice rough with Lay Tower gravel. "Lane 17, southbound." Only static answered at first. Then faintly, a man's voice, remote and crackling. 17 southbound, you're running quiet tonight. Keep both hands on the wheel. Fog sitting low. There was something slightly odd about the voice. It sounded like it was coming from far away, not in distance, but in time, too clear, too clean, some older cadence to his speech. Before Daniel could answer, the CB lapsed back into a breathy hush. He frowned, thumb tapping idly on the mic, then set it back in its cradle. The first wisps of fog appeared like phantoms creeping onto the road, thin veils sliding across the beams, dissolving as the truck cut through them. The air ahead looked soft, edges blurring. In the mirrors, the world behind him began to smudge, the red pinpoints of his trailer lights haloed. He eased off the throttle just a hair, not enough to break his momentum, only enough to give himself room to react. The engine note dropped a half step, a small, familiar sigh. His hands found the 10N2 grip on the wheel and settled in steady. The fog thickened almost imperceptibly at first, layers stacking upon layers. What had been a lace curtain became a wall. Within minutes, the world outside his windshield was reduced to a bleached tunnel with no ceiling and no visible end. The shoulder, the trees, the distant suggestion of fence posts, all were gone. Only the center line, bright and freshly painted, remained as an anchor, a lifeline threading through the gray void. Sound, too, seemed to change. The roar of the engine dulled as if muffled by heavy drapes. The hiss of the tires on wet pavement took on a softer, whispering quality. Even the rattle of the empty hangars in his sleeper faded, leaving only the deep, constant rumble beneath his feet. Daniel's eyes flicked again to the clock. 1:24 a.m. He took a sip of coffee. It had cooled, lukewarm and bitter, but it grounded him. The taste, the weight of the thermos in his hand, were tangible, real things in a night that was beginning to feel oddly insubstantial. Somewhere far off, a lonely train horn moaned once long and low, then fell silent. There were no tracks nearby, not for miles, but sometimes sound traveled strange in bad weather. He told himself that and watched the white line unspool. After 10 minutes, or what his body thought might be 10 minutes, he noticed the first billboard. It loomed out of the fog in startling size, its colors muted and flat in the mist. A smiling woman held up a slice of pie, steam coiling from it like a question mark. The Last Stop Diner, open 24 hours, home of the Miller Mile Pie. He barely had time to register it before it slid away. His high beams caught the glint of rain crawling down its face, though he couldn't feel any on his windshield. Another 5 minutes. Another sip of coffee. The fog didn't thin. If anything, it seemed to be growing denser, the beams pressing against it like hands on frosted glass. The lane markers ahead appeared later and later, forcing him to trust that the road still ran straight. The next billboard materialized suddenly, so close he almost flinched. Same woman, same pie, same cheerful slogan. Only the pie was tilted slightly more in her hand, and her eyes, he was almost sure, were looking directly at him now. He told himself it was just an identical ad. Businesses did that along long stretches of interstate, hammering the idea into the minds of weary drivers. But something prickled under his skin, a thin line of unease running the length of his spine. When the third billboard appeared, the pie was missing a bite. Crumbs dotted the plate. The woman's smile was softer, almost secretive, as though she held on to a joke he hadn't been told. The words were the same, but the font looked older, slightly cracked, as if the paint itself had aged. Daniel's fingers tightened imperceptibly on the wheel. "You're tired, that's all," he muttered, though the soft cocoon of the cab swallowed the sound quickly. The human brain loved patterns, he knew. Give it a half glimpse of something familiar, and it would rearrange the pieces to make a story. Tonight, alone in a world made of fog, his mind was apparently rummaging for any distraction it could find. Still, the next time the digital clock winked into his peripheral vision, some small part of him balked. 1:24 a.m. He blinked, frowning. Maybe he'd read it wrong before. Highway monotony had a way of bending the sense of time out of true. He watched the seconds tick. 1:24, 1:24, 1:24. They did not move. He looked back to the road, heart tapping once against his ribs in a slightly faster cadence. The lane line flowed under his truck like a white conveyor belt, perfectly regular. The speedometer read a steady 62. Outside, the fog did not break, did not thin, did not change at all. He checked the analog wristwatch he kept strapped beneath his sleeve, more out of habit than trust. Its thin, silver hand sat at an angle that did not match the glowing numbers on the dash. According to the watch, it was closer to 2. For a moment, he entertained the thought that the digital clock had simply frozen. Electronics glitched. Maybe the damp had crept in somewhere it shouldn't, but the display wasn't dead or flickering. It was bright, unwavering. He lifted the CB mic again. "Any drivers on the Miller line copy," he said, steady but a shade quieter now. "Check your time for me, would you?" Static, then a ghost of voices tangled together, like several stations bleeding into one another. Snatches rose clear for a second before being lost again. "Yeah, I seen that fog there you just keep. Always at 1:24, that's when. Used to be a diner, out past the hollow you can't miss." He let the mic fall from his fingers, dangling by its cord, the small plastic weight gently tapping against the console. The hair on his arm stood up, his skin suddenly too aware of the air inside the cab, of the mild chill from the vents, of the way his seatbelt pressed across his chest. Far ahead, a smear of light appeared in the fog, diffuse and warm, the color of candle flame behind frosted glass. As he approached, it resolved into a small cluster of yellowish orbs, hovering at the approximate height of street lamps. Relief mingled with caution. A pull-off in this weather would be a godsend, a place to stretch, to recenter, to let his nerves stop doing their quiet dance. The signs appeared one by one, washed in fog. Last stop diner 1 mile. Exit 19B, food fuel showers. He did not remember there being an exit 19B on this run. He had driven this route twice a week for 3 years. The exits were as familiar to him as the dents in his own truck. Nonetheless, there it was, a green metal promise, its reflective surface flicking back his high beams in an otherworldly glow. The ramp materialized out of the murk like an escape hatch, veering off the interstate with a surprising sharpness. He eased onto it, feeling the slight lean of the cab, the subtle shift of weight in the trailer. The fog followed, clinging, reluctant to let him go. The ramp descended gently, then curved, an elegant arc that seemed to wrap around a pocket of low ground. The truck rolled past skeletal trees shrouded in white, their branches dripping with condensation. The pavement here was darker, older, patched in places with rougher asphalt. Then, as though someone had pulled back a curtain, the fog thinned. Shapes emerged, solid and definite. A gravel lot, slick with a fine sheen of moisture. A row of darkened fuel pumps, their hoses hanging like limp arms. Beyond them, a low, long building with a neon sign buzzing quietly to itself. Last stop diner. The sign's red letters were half burned out, leaving only LAS Sto Din R to glow dimly in the damp. A single semi sat at the far edge of the lot, its outline hazy, its lights off. It was an older model, boxy and square-shouldered, painted a dull, unremarkable blue. Its trailer bore no company logo, only a strip of reflective tape that caught Daniel's headlights and shimmered. He pulled in slowly, tires crunching over gravel, and parked near the entrance, the engine idling down to a patient chug. When he killed the headlights, the world shrank to the pool of light around the diner and the faint halo of the street lamp above his cab. The fog lapped at the edges of that light, an opaque ocean waiting to roll back in. Inside the truck, the sudden quiet was almost startling. Without the engine's constant, low roar, every smaller sound rushed in to fill the void. The ticking of cooling metal, the soft whoosh of his own breath, the faint hum of the refrigerator unit in the trailer. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears, not racing, just insistently present. He checked the dash clock one more time. 1:24 a.m. it sat there, unbothered, as if it had always been that. His wristwatch said 2:11. He told himself again that it was a glitch. Then he opened the door and cold, damp air rolled in, smelling of wet gravel, old coffee, and a distant sweetness he couldn't place. The fog felt close against his face, as though it had crowded up to the very edge of the lot and was watching, waiting. His boots hit the ground with a muted thud. The other truck at the far end of the lot remained dark and still, no movement at its cab, no glow from its sleeper window. For a moment, Daniel had the odd impression that it was not parked so much as abandoned, left in place and forgotten. Its license plate caught his eye. The numbers were indistinct in the dim, but the arrangement nagged at some corner of his mind familiar, like a phone number he dialed in another life. He crossed the lot. Each step sounded slightly wrong, as if the gravel were deeper than it appeared, or as though there were something plush and yielding just beneath its surface. His breath puffed faintly in front of him, not quite turning to visible mist, but flirting with the idea. The diner's front door resisted for half a second before yielding, the bell above it chiming a note just a fraction flat. Warmth met him, tinged with the smell of frying oil, dish soap, and a lingering thread of cigarette smoke that had been extinguished years ago, but somehow never fully left. Inside, time had stalled somewhere between decades. Red vinyl booths with silver piping lined the windows, their seats polished smooth by countless travelers. A long counter ran the length of the room, its surface a marbled laminate that had seen better days. Behind it, a row of glass cake stands stood at attention, their domes cloudy with age. The overhead lights buzzed softly, casting a yellowish hue over everything. A radio somewhere in the kitchen played a song so low it was more memory than sound, just the faint shape of a melody from a station that might or might not be local. An analog clock ticked on the far wall. Its hands hovered at 1:24. There were only 3 other people present. A man in a cap sat in the nearest booth, hands wrapped around a white mug, staring into the middle distance. His jacket had that flat, sun-faded look of something that had been worn for years in all weather. In the far corner, an older woman methodically wiped down a tabletop that was already clean, her motions slow, almost ritualistic. Behind the counter stood a waitress with a notepad, her hair pinned back in a style that had been fashionable at some point, but was now simply hers. She looked up as Daniel entered, and her smile was immediate, soft, as if she'd been expecting him. "Even in, honey," she said. "Fog's a mean one tonight." The words were ordinary. The way she said them was not. There was no surprise in her voice, no polite distance, only the murmur of recognition, as though he'd stepped in from his truck for the 1,000th time rather than the first. "Yeah," he replied, shrugging off his jacket's damp chill. "Had to get out of it for a bit. Place was hard to spot and all that." Her eyes, a pale, washed-out green, flicked toward the window where the fog pressed close. "You found us," she said mildly. "That's what counts. Sit where you like. Coffee." The steam curling up from the pot on the burner seemed too slow, too languid. He watched it for a heartbeat longer than necessary, then nodded. "Coffee'd be great. Maybe a slice of that pie, too." He gestured at the nearest cake stand, more to ground himself in something than out of hunger. She followed his hand and chuckled quietly. "That one's lemon meringue, but I know what you mean." She tilted her head toward a pie at the far end of the counter. He hadn't noticed it before, though it had surely been there. Its crust was golden and fluted, top latticed over a glossy, cinnamon-dusted filling. Miller Mile, how special. The same pie from the billboard. His stomach tightened, not unpleasantly, more like the moment before a coin flips and lands. "Sure," he said. "Why not?" He slid onto a stool at the counter. The vinyl was warm, as if someone had just vacated it. The man in the booth did not look up, and yet Daniel had the unshakable feeling of being watched, not by eyes, but by attention. The kind of noticing that filled a space without moving. The waitress poured his coffee. It was stronger than he expected, the aroma rich and dark, almost chocolatey. When he lifted the mug, the ceramic was hot enough to sting his fingers, but the liquid inside, when it touched his tongue, was only comfortably warm. It carried a faint flavor he couldn't name, like the echo of something from childhood. "What time you got?" he asked, casually, glancing at the wall clock. Its hand still pointed unwaveringly at 1:24. She followed his gaze, then checked a small silver watch pinned to her collar. For a moment, something like a shadow crossed her face, gone before it settled. "Time enough, sugar," she said. "You're not late." not late for what he didn't ask. The pie arrived, neatly plated, the crust flacking at the edges, the filling dark and glossy, flecked with what might have been apple or might have been something else entirely. Steam rose from it in thin, curling threads. He ate slowly. Each bite was comforting in an almost eerie way, like food remembered from long ago rather than tasted for the first time. Around him, the diner hummed in a low, steady rhythm, the soft clink of dishes, the shuffle of the older woman's shoes on the tile, the murmur of the far-off radio. At some point, the man in the booth lifted his mug in a small, deliberate salute. Daniel met his eyes for the first time and found them a pale, washed-out blue. There was something in them that was not quite sadness, not quite relief. "Road's different in the fog," the man said. His voice was rough around the edges, unused. "Stretches out, folds over on itself, shows you what you missed." Daniel swallowed a mouthful of coffee, the warmth spreading through his chest. "Missed." The man glanced toward the window where the fog pressed like a living thing. Exits you blew by, calls you didn't make, stops you were too tired to take. He gave a small, crooked smile. "Places like this." The older woman at the table began humming under her breath, the same tune as the distant radio, only half a beat slower. The clock on the wall ticked. 1:24, 1:24, 1:24. The tension in Daniel's shoulders eased without his permission. The diner, with its faded booths and humming lights, wrapped around him like an old blanket. He felt drowsy, but not in the dangerous, edge-of-the-wheel way. It was a softer drowsiness, the kind that came when he was safe, when someone else could carry the next watch. He might have stayed longer, hours maybe, or minutes, time that didn't behave in ways that obeyed the logic he carried in his logbooks. Yet eventually, in some quiet corner of his mind, the part of him that measured miles and deadlines stirred. There was freight in his trailer, destinations on the far side of dawn. Rest here felt like borrowing against something he did not fully own. "How much do I owe you?" he asked, sliding a folded bill onto the counter. The waitress looked at it, then at him, and her smile softened further. "You've already paid," she said. He frowned. "Pretty sure I haven't." "You stopped," she replied simply. "That's the hardest part." She nudged the bill back toward him with a fingertip. "Keep it. You'll need it where you're going." Outside, the fog pulsed against the windows, thick and patient. The man in the booth stood slowly, leaving his empty mug behind. As he passed Daniel, he laid a hand on his shoulder, light, almost weightless. "Watch your mirrors," he murmured. "Fog likes to follow itself." The touch left no heat, no lingering pressure, only the faintest awareness that it had happened at all. The bell over the door chimed flatly as the man stepped out into the gray and was swallowed whole. When Daniel stepped back into the lot a few minutes later, his truck looked exactly as he'd left it. The other rig at the far end sat just as still, but as he glanced at its plate this time, the numbers resolved sharply into something he recognized with a small shock. His own truck's registration, transposed, mirrored as though seen in a reflection. The urge to look away was strong. He did. Climbing into his cab felt like crawling back into a shell that had been briefly, mercifully set aside. The pillow in his sleeper still bore the shallow depression of his last nap. The air inside carried his scent, coffee and fabric softener and road dust. He checked the dash clock before he turned the key. 1:24 a.m. His wristwatch said 3:02. The engine rumbled to life without protest. The lot lights shimmered on his windshield. The neon diner sign buzzed its fractured LASTO din R one last time. As he eased back up the ramp, the fog met him eagerly, rolling over the hood, embracing the cab. In his side mirror, for a fraction of a second, he thought he saw another truck pulling out of the lot in perfect tandem with his own, matching his angle, his speed. Its lights were his lights, its shape his shape, its trailer length identical. He blinked, and the mirror showed only the familiar rectangle of his refrigerated box, glowing red at the corners, haloed by mist. The merge back onto the interstate was seamless. The center line reappeared, patient and straight. The fog, though still thick, seemed looser now, less intent on swallowing the world. Shapes of trees emerged now and then at the road's edge, and distant, muted stars peered through thinning clouds. He drove until the digital numbers on the dash finally twitched. 1:25 a.m. They rolled forward with a quiet, almost reluctant resolve. His wristwatch ticked along, unbothered, the gap between them slowly shrinking. Dawn found him many miles beyond Miller County, the sky bleeding from inky blue to soft gray, the horizon tinged with the color of old bruised peaches. The fog had pulled back into hollows and ditches, trailing wisps over ponds and fields. At the first modern truck stop, a bright, sprawling complex of LED signs and neatly arranged pumps, he pulled in to fuel and log his hours. The clerk behind the counter, young and distracted, scanned his card without real interest. "Ran the Miller last night?" she asked absently, glancing at the register's screen. "Yeah," he said. "Foggy." "Yeah. Should have seen it a couple years back," she added. "Wreck out there shut down the whole county for a week. Old diner too. They finally tore it down. Place had been closed for 30, 40 years," she shrugged. "Nobody stopped there anymore. No reason to." He hesitated. "Last stop diner." She looked up properly this time, surprised. "You know it." He thought of the warm coffee that never cooled, the pie that tasted like memory, the clock that never changed, the way the fog had pressed at the glass as if longing to be let in. "Heard some talk on the radio," he said carefully. "Stories. Drivers like to talk." She smiled, the quick, dismissive smile of someone used to hearing road myths. "Yeah, they do. Gotta stay awake somehow." Back in his truck, he flipped open his logbook. The neat columns stared back at him, waiting to be filled. Between 1:13 and 3:00 a.m., he was supposed to account for the miles he'd covered, the rest he'd taken, the stops he'd made. His pencil paused above the page. For a moment, he considered writing it down exactly as it had happened, or as close as memory could manage. Exit 19B, last stop diner. Pie, coffee, a clock that held its breath. Fog that folded the road. Instead, he noted, weather delay, dense fog, reduced speed. The rest of the line stayed blank, a quiet omission between miles and minutes. The next week on the same route, he watched for the exit. Miller County line approached, the skull graffiti leering faintly in his high beams. Fog gathered in low places, but never thickened to the same world-swallowing degree. He drove with both hands on the wheel, eyes scanning the green signs. There was no 19B, the numbers jumped cleanly, from 18 to 20. On the CB, a voice crackled in the static, faint yet familiar. "Lane 17 southbound," it said, with the slow confidence of someone who had made the run 1,000 times. "Fog sittin' low. Watch your mirrors." Daniel glanced at the radio, then at the empty passenger seat. The thermos in the holder steamed softly. The digital clock on the dash rolled from 1:23 to 1:24. On the horizon ahead, for the barest instant, he thought he saw a warm, diffuse glow in the fog. The color of neon filtered through time. The promise of coffee and pie on a road that never quite went straight. He blinked and it was gone. The Miller line stretched out in front of him, gray and quiet and impossibly long. The white center line threading through the mist like a story told and retold. Never quite the same twice, always starting again at 1:24 a.m. Story number 2. By the time Elena Ruiz reached the base of Highland Pass, the night had settled into that deep, velvet stillness that belonged only to the mountains. Her truck, 13 tons of steel and humming machinery, felt small against the dark bulk of the ridgeline rising ahead. Pines climbed the slopes in close, serried ranks, their needles catching what little light the stars spared and holding it like secrets. Her headlights lanced forward, carving out a narrow world of pale asphalt and reflective paint. Beyond that short tunnel of vision, the mountains were suggestion and shadow, their true shape guessed rather than seen. The sky overhead was a low, indigo dome, cloudless yet somehow heavy, as if it too pressed down on the pass. The dashboard glowed with soft instrument light, greens and blues and amber numerals. Familiar constellations, these, more predictable than the ones outside. Fuel levels, oil pressure, engine temperature, all steady. The GPS screen traced her progress in a thin, glowing line that wound up through contour lines and switchbacks toward the plateau. It was just after 2 in the morning. Her logbook would later show a neat entry. Highland Pass, fog forecast, proceed with caution. For now, she only had the quiet murmur of the weather band replaying in the back of her mind. Dense valley fog forming after midnight, visibility reduced, especially near the reservoir. She clicked the CB to channel 19 out of habit. Static greeted her, a soft, ragged hiss. Once in a while it swelled with a snatch of distant conversation, a call sign, a mile marker uttered by some unseen colleague, but mostly the airwaves were empty. The truck stop outside Milford, 2 hours behind her now, lingered in her memory. Steam rising from coffee cups, fluorescent lights humming. The low, winding cadence of a veteran driver spinning stories at the communal table. He'd worn a denim jacket patched with the logos of companies that had long since folded, and his eyes had the faraway gleam of someone who had watched a lot of miles slide under his wheels. "Highland's got her moods," he'd said, stirring sugar into his coffee like it was an old habit that kept his hands busy while his mind roamed. "You'll see fog thick enough to carve your initials in. And if you hit it just wrong, you might catch the hollow convoy." Elena had raised an eyebrow. "The what?" He'd smiled without teeth. "Line of trucks comes out of nowhere when the soup gets real bad. No engine noise, no brake whine, just lights. You tuck in behind them and they'll drag you through the worst of it, long as you don't look too close at what's hitched to your back." She laughed that off kindly. She knew how these things started. Too many lonely nights in a cab, too many hours of white lines and static, and the mind went hunting for stories. He just shrugged and gone back to his coffee. Now, as she climbed toward the pass, the memory sat with her in the cab like a quiet passenger. The first hint of fog was a faint, silvery smear over the guardrail where the highway edged close to the reservoir. The water itself was invisible, a flat absence of light beyond the shoulder, but mist coiled up from it, pale and delicate. Her beams caught it and turned it into a ghostly cascade, rising and falling in slow motion. Another half-mile, and the wisps thickened into low banks that spilled gently across the pavement. They were still scattered, easy enough to see through, but they made the world feel subtly less solid, like someone had turned the contrast down. She eased back on the throttle, watching her speed drop a few miles per hour. The engine tone shifted, a deeper note humming through the cab. Somewhere in the back, a loose hanger ticked faintly with each bump. The climb steepened. The road curled, hugging the shoulder of the mountain. On one side, rock cut bared its rough, striated face. On the other, the world fell away into the white softened void of the valley. Yellow chevrons appeared, warning of sharp turns ahead, their arrows muted by the fog beginning to gather in earnest. By the time she passed the sign reading elevation 2,800 FT, the fog had stopped flirting and committed fully. It poured across the road like breath on cold glass, joining with itself until the high beams had only a few truck lengths to work with. The edges of the asphalt blurred, and the guardrail became a gray suggestion. Sound changed with it. The steady roar of her tires on the pavement became more muffled, as if the fog absorbed it. The night lost its echoes. Her own engine became the loudest thing in existence, the familiar rumble suddenly intimate and oddly fragile. She flicked the fog lights on. They cut low and wide across the asphalt, turning suspended droplets into a fine, swirling galaxy. Her hands tightened on the wheel, not in panic, but in that focused anticipation that came when instinct sharpened. "Highland Pass," she muttered under her breath. "Show me what you've got." The CB popped softly. She raised a hand without looking and nudged the volume. "Any northbound on Highland come back?" she asked, her voice calm but pitched to carry. Static, then a faint, clipped reply washed in distance. "Northbound at the Hollows," the voice said. Male, old-fashioned drawl. Fogs rolled in, keep her between the lines. The Hollows. She eyed the GPS. If the topography reading was to be believed, she wasn't there yet. The Hollows, where the road dipped after the pass, was still 20 miles ahead. She considered replying, asking for a mile marker. But the signal thinned to a ghost and then was gone. Minutes slid past in the careful monotony of fog driving. The odometer ticked in slow, reassuring increments. Her wipers whispered now and then, clearing away condensation that clung in a fine sheen to the glass. Drops beaded on the mirrors and quivered with every micro-vibration of the cab. A shape emerged ahead, faint twin red glows hovering in the murk. Tail lights. She hadn't seen any headlights coming up on her mirrors. No slow approach from behind, no distant pinpricks growing. 1 second the night had been empty. The next, someone was ahead of her, already installed in the lane, the exact right distance away. Alina's foot eased off the throttle. The gap widened slightly, then held steady. The lights themselves were odd, dimmer than modern LEDs, more like the deep ruby glow of old incandescent bulbs. They sat a little higher than she expected, as if mounted on a cab with different proportions than the streamlined models on the road these days. She leaned forward, squinting through the fog. The rest of the truck was only a darker shadow inside the moving white, a suggestion of boxy angles and rounded roof lines. "Where'd you come from?" she murmured. She reached for the CB. "Northbound ahead of me on Highland," she called. "You got a copy?" Nothing, just the quiet rush of static, as if the channel itself were holding its breath. The red eyes ahead of her kept the same unhurried pace. 50 miles per hour, give or take. Too steady to be accidental. They rounded a curve and Alina followed, grateful for the hint of trajectory they provided. She tried adjusting her speed, first slowing, then surging a little. Each time, the lights responded strangely. When she slowed, they seemed to drift back just enough to maintain their buffer. When she accelerated, they didn't get any closer than before. The gap between them and her truck remained stubbornly constant, as if some invisible rubber band connected them. A low, shivering sensation ran along her spine. Not fear exactly, but the unsettling awareness of something not behaving quite right. On the very edge of hearing, like someone talking in the next room with the door almost closed, the CB crackled. This time, multiple voices tangled in the noise, all with that slightly dated cadence, an old rhythm to their speech. "Copy that, way station's open tonight. Dragging steel up to the mill, she's heavy but she'll climb. Hollow convoys rollin', boys, keep it tight." She listened, half of her attention anchored to the road, half snagged on the words. The mill they mentioned, Highland Steel, had shuttered 15 years ago. She'd driven past its rusting shell on this very route. Windows broken, sign faded. Convoy. The word tapped against the back of her thoughts like a moth at glass. She risked a glance in her side mirror. Fog stared back, silver gray and impenetrable. No approaching headlights, but something about the quality of the white denser. Layered, suggested shapes back there, hidden in the thickness. The road kept climbing, then began, almost imperceptibly, to level. A green sign loomed out of the murk, its letters visible only for an instant in the slice of her beams. Highland Pass Summit, elevation 3,600 FT. Below that, a smaller sign, Way Station 1 mile, all trucks. She frowned. Highland's Way Station, as far as she knew, had been closed for years. The last time she'd checked, the big blue sign had said Way Station closed, next right rest area. Dispatch sometimes joked about how the old platform had sunk on one side, making everyone mysteriously overweight on paper. Ahead, the taillights, the anchor, her strange guide, slowed slightly as if anticipating a turn. The fog brightened faintly from the right. Sodium vapor glow diffused into creamy halos. Her GPS screen glitched once, the crisp line of the interstate blinking and reforming with a tiny, almost stuttering jump. A momentary flicker of an alternate route threaded across it, ghost pale, then vanished. The off-ramp appeared with unnerving suddenness, a darker cut in the pale. The truck ahead took it without signaling, its lights veering gracefully to the right. Elena hesitated. If this was some weird, unannounced construction detour, missing it might get her stuck trying to turn around on a grade in a fog that was getting thicker by the minute. The fact that the wait station shouldn't be operating nagged at her, but the alternative, charging blind into hairpins with no guide at all, nagged harder. She followed. The ramp curled down and around, the angle of descent steeper than she expected. Tall pines loomed on either side, their trunks fading quickly into the white, their crowns invisible. The glow she'd seen intensified. Yellow-tinted light pooled ahead, flat and oddly gentle, like luminous fog pressed into a shallow bowl. The first shape she recognized was the silhouette of the way station itself. Low building, cantilevered canopy stretching over a wide concrete pad. Fluorescent tubes buzzed under the overhang, their hum heightened in the muffled acoustics. The rectangular office block at the side glowed from within. A neon open sign clung to the window, its red letters flickering slightly as if straining to stay lit. On the access road, 3 trucks idled in a line. Their outlines were softened by mist, but she could make out cab-over designs long vanished from modern fleets, square noses and old logos she dimly recalled from childhood Resteria billboards. One trailer bore the faded emblem of Highland Steel, still bright in its stubborn cobalt. Elena's gaze swung back to the cab directly ahead of her. She could see it more clearly now. It was an older Freightliner, paint a muted forest green, chrome dulled but well kept. Its stacks rose straight and tall, no curved tips, no decorative flares. On its door, in white hand-lettered script, was a company name she didn't recognize and a dot number that looked wrong, too short. Her own engine idled, the familiar rumble wrapping around her like a cloak. And yet, in the line ahead, the other trucks seemed eerily quiet. Their exhausts puffed faintly into the cold air, but she heard no distinct notes from them, no overlapping symphony of diesels. It was as if her ears had decided to filter them out, or as if they were too far away to hear, while still sitting 15 yards in front of her. The line crept forward. When it was nearly her turn, a figure stepped out from the wash of yellow light. A man in a reflective vest, its neon stripes faded, held a flashlight with a green lens, the beam slicing through the fog like a soft emerald blade. He raised it, pointing toward the platform. She rolled down her window a crack. Cold, damp air pushed in, laced with the smells of wet concrete and long-steeped coffee. The man's face came into focus as he approached, late middle age, weather-creased, expression neutral in the habitual way of people who had watched a million trucks pass by. His cap sat low, its brim shadowing his eyes, but she glimpsed a glint of gray at his temples. "Evenin', driver," he said. His voice was surprisingly clear, not distorted at all by the weather or the enclosed space. "Go on ahead nice and slow. We'll get a wait on you." Elena hesitated. Words perched on the edge of her tongue. "I thought this place was closed. How long have you been working here?" But they felt strange, out of place, like asking the sun how long it had been in the sky. She eased onto the scale. The transition from asphalt to concrete was barely perceptible. The platform took her weight with the faintest shudder, a sensation in her fingertips rather than her feet. In front of the cab, an old-style display box flickered to life. Red numbers rolled upward with a gentle whirring sound, settling on a figure that matched, down to the last pound, what her own onboard system had given her at the shipper. The weighmaster glanced at a clipboard, an actual clipboard with sheets of paper curling slightly at the edges. A ballpoint pen hung from a string. Through the office window behind him, she saw more of the same. Metal filing cabinets, a wall map peppered with colored pins, a coffee pot half full and sitting on a hot plate, its glass stained brown. "You're good," he said, looking up at last with the faintest hint of a smile. His eyes, when she met them, were a soft hazel, and something in them felt older than his face. "Right on the money." She swallowed. "How late are you open?" she asked, the question coming out different than it had sounded in her head. He tilted his head, as if listening to another conversation layered under theirs. For a breath or two, the fog seemed to hold even more tightly around the building, as though it, too, were leaning in to hear. "Depends what you mean by late," he replied slowly. "Convoy rolls when it needs to. Some nights we're just ghosts with the lights off. Some nights," he gestured vaguely toward the line of trucks, toward the glowing open sign, "we run hot all the way through till morning." The CB hummed at her elbow. Out of the static, a voice rose, strong and clear this time, cutting across decades of slang and equipment. "Hollow convoy all accounted for at the top. Bringing one more through. She's not from our run, but she's in the line." The Waymaster's eyes flicked briefly to the radio, then back to her. "You stay tucked in with them," he said, as if continuing an older conversation. "They know the turns when you can't see your own hood, and don't linger in the mirrors longer than you have to." He stepped back, raising his flashlight in a lazy, practiced arc that signaled she was free to go. The instructions slipped into her like a second heartbeat. She rolled forward off the scale and back onto the access road. Ahead, the green Freightliner's taillights glowed patiently, waiting. Behind her, through the small rectangle of the sleeper's back window, for one brief, surreal instant, she saw more lights spreading away into the fog. Headlights, marker lamps, cab lights, a constellation of trucks in formation. Some were tall and modern, others squat and boxy, a few bearing liveries she recognized only from old photographs. Then the angle changed, and all she saw was white again. They pulled out of the way station and back onto the highway. The ramp felt different somehow, broader and slower, as if the whole mountain had shifted to make room for them. The convoy, because that was what it was now, no question, settled into a smooth, unhurried descent. Alina's world shrank to the glowing red squares ahead and the reflection of her own dashboard in the glass. Her wipers marked time with a steady tempo. Her hands found a grip so natural it might have been muscle memory living deeper than she knew. Down they went, traced along a route that seemed at once familiar and slightly askew. Curves arrived a hair earlier than her memory predicted, or a few yards further along. The guardrails, when they appeared in brief glimpses, had a different pattern of posts. A rock outcropping she liked to use as a mental landmark was simply not there, replaced by a smoother slope. She glanced once, quickly, at the GPS. The screen showed her on the blue line of the interstate, all right, but the terrain view had flattened, as though the mountains had been pressed down. The little arrow marking her truck pointed along, unfazed, while some part of the digital mapping struggled to decide exactly what lay beneath her wheels. On the CB, chatter rose and fell like the breathing of something large. Voices called out curves, grades, bits of weather. None of them sounded panicked. There was a calm to the way they spoke, the kind of easy cadence that came from long familiarity with a dangerous road. "Fog's thick at the Narrows. Watch that off-camber turn. Breaker at the Hollows. Ponds throwing up steam. Hold your lane." "Copy that lead. Been a while since we took her in this deep." She realized, after a while, that every now and then someone mentioned a mile marker that didn't exist anymore. "Rolling past 58, one driver said with quiet satisfaction, and she knew there had never been a mile marker 58 on this pass in her lifetime. The numbering had changed after they rerouted the lower section. Her own mouth stayed closed, her thumb resting on the CB key without pressing. For once, the urge to join the threaded voices, to swap call signs and little jokes, stayed tamped down. It felt, in some way she couldn't articulate, like interrupting a conversation between old friends who were letting her sit in on something sacred. Time thinned or thickened or stepped sideways. She could not have said later how long that descent lasted. 10 minutes, 30, an hour. Her body didn't doze. Every muscle stayed quietly attuned to the subtle corrections and adjustments of fog driving, but her mind fell into a strange, floating clarity. At one point, a darker shape loomed off to the right, beyond the guardrail, just close enough for her lights to touch it. A building, 2 stories, windows dark, a faded signboard leaning toward the highway. For a second, she thought she saw the Highland Steel logo ghosting its side. Then it was gone, swallowed by the gray as if it had never existed. The fog began, almost imperceptibly, to lighten. Not break up, not yet, but soften at its edges. The white turned from dense marble to something more translucent. The red of the taillights ahead smeared less. Here and there, she caught glimpses of treetops, of a scrap of sky with the faintest hint of paling along its eastward edge. The voices on the CB grew sparser. One by one, drivers called out a 1010 or a catch you on the flip in languages of habit that spanned eras. Static flowed back in to fill the gaps. A green sign loomed ahead. This one she saw more clearly, the letters posing crisply in her beams. Welcome to Garner County. Elevation 1,200 FT. The hollows, where the mountain finally eased itself into rolling foothills, lay somewhere beyond. And then, as the grade gentled and the road straightened, the taillights in front of her simply weren't there. No fade-out, no distant shrinking. One heartbeat, the green cab's rear end was a steady, reassuring presence in the white. The next, her headlights reached only empty fog and the faint silver ribbon of lane markers stretching forward on their own. Her truck rolled on. The engine note sounded suddenly louder again, solitary. The mirrors showed only thinning mist, lightening by degrees into a curtain of silver gauze. The CB hissed, an unadorned wash. In the east, the sky went from deep blue to a color like damp paper, a suggestion of sunrise, not yet visible but coming. Mile marker 12 stood at the roadside, its reflective face catching the first weak suggestion of dawn. Elena blinked at it. She knew, with the absolute certainty of someone who had driven a stretch of highway 100 times, that she should be nearer 26 by now. She reached for the GPS. The little arrow solemnly reported her position, almost exactly where she would have been had she driven the pass at 50 miles per hour with no stops, no detours, no inexplicable way stations. Her estimated arrival time at the receiver had barely budged. She drove in silence until the fog frayed, lifting in tatters that clung only in low dips and around water. The world re-emerged, the gray shapes of barns, the suggestion of distant porch lights, a lone gas station glowing in the pre-dawn. At the first proper rest area, she pulled off. The sky was a soft, washed-out gray now, touched with a hint of peach at the horizon. A few other trucks sat in the lot, mufflers ticking, drivers perhaps grabbing an hour of sleep before the day crowd surged. Elena set her brakes and let the engine idle down before she shut it off. The cab sighed into quiet. Outside, birds had begun the tentative first notes of morning. Inside the rest area building, the air smelled of industrial cleaner and coffee. A few travelers dozed in reclined chairs. A television in the corner murmured a muted newscast, the visuals flickering without sound. She poured herself a cup of coffee from a metal urn and carried it to a table by the window. On the wall nearby, a faded information poster detailed the history of Highland Pass. There was a black and white photograph of the way station from the 1970s, trucks lined up on the scale, a man in a reflective vest holding a clipboard neon sign in the window glowing open. She stepped closer, heartbeat slowing and then resuming in a different pattern. The weighmaster in the picture was younger, his hair darker, but the set of his shoulders, the shape of his jaw, the angle at which he wore his cap, those were the same. The caption beneath the photo mentioned the station's closure in the late 1990s, after technological updates and route changes rendered it unnecessary. Her own reflection blurred faintly over the image in the glass. Behind her, a passerby glanced at the photograph and then at her. "My granddad used to talk about that place," he said with absent fondness. "Said the fog up there could make time get away from you if you weren't careful." He smiled and moved on without waiting for a reply. Back in her truck, Elena opened her logbook. The section covering Highland Pass was clean and straightforward. No stop recorded, no scale ticket stapled in, just a smooth, uninterrupted line of driving time. She flipped on the CB, more out of habit than expectation. It hissed, then crackled. For a moment, cutting through the static like a familiar tune, she heard a voice. "Hollow convoy clear at the bottom," it said, easy and satisfied. "Highlands quiet again. Catch you boys on the far side." She reached for the mic with an impulse that was more instinct than thought. But by the time her fingers curled around it, the channel was empty save for the ordinary chatter of a new day. Weather reports, jokes, a driver complaining about construction 2 states over. She pulled out of the rest area as the first honest streaks of sunlight painted the sky. The mountains behind her were wrapped in their thinning blankets of fog, peaceful now, as if they had never held anything stranger than a bit of low cloud. Somewhere up there, she thought as she merged back onto the interstate, there was an old building with lights that sometimes flickered on in the heart of a cloud, and a line of trucks that appeared only when the world shrank to a few feet of painted line, and the need to keep moving became a quiet ache in the chest. She imagined them just for a moment. All the drivers who had ever rolled the pass at night, their rigs idling in some shared pocket of mist, waiting their turn to guide the next one through. The road stretched ahead, clear and open now, the white lines bright in the morning light. She set her cruise and let the truck settle into its stride, the memory of the red taillights still glowing somewhere in the back of her mind like embers that refused to go out. Story number 3. On the long, flat spine of Highway 61, where the land rolled in shallow swells of soybean fields and fallow corn, fog did not fall from above so much as seep up from the ground. It curled out of roadside ditches and river bottoms, pooling low and thick, gathering itself like a quiet decision. Mason Clark watched it begin as a pale suggestion along the shoulders, fine as breath, while the last of the evening color seeped out of the sky. A faint, diluted scrap of sunset burned orange in his mirrors. Ahead, the world had already gone the violet blue of approaching night. His truck's headlights clicked on automatically, washing the 2-lane in buttery light and turning the first fingers of mist into something almost solid. The cab of his Freightliner was a familiar cave of soft glow and humming machinery. The instrument cluster painted his hands in muted green as they rested on the wheel. The GPS mapped the road ahead in a sure, bright line that cut through empty space, the kind of empty that came from vast, unbroken acres of fields and windbreaks and little else. The digital clock on the dash said 12:07. His logbook, neatly filled up in 10-minute increments, would later confirm it. He'd left St. Louis just after dusk, trailer full of frozen goods humming behind him, and now he was cutting north through southern Iowa, bound for a distribution center that slept all day and came alive just before dawn. The truck's interior smelled faintly of coffee gone cool in the travel mug, of his own soap, of the persistent background of diesel and road dust that no amount of cleaning ever fully erased. The hum of the engine was a comfort more than a noise, a low, constant vibration that had underpinned so much of his life these last years that silence sometimes felt stranger. He reached out and adjusted the dial on the AM/FM radio with 2 fingers, more out of habit than boredom. The satellite unit on the dash, bright with playlists and podcasts, remained off. Nights like this, he preferred the old analog feel of terrestrial radio, frequencies that bent and warped with distance and weather, that carried local accents and late-night strangeness. Static washed over the speakers as he thumbed past country ballads, high school sports recaps, a preacher in a suit and tie rhythmically underlining his points. Somewhere beyond the static, always, was the sound of other people awake in the dark. Outside, the fog thickened into twisted scarves that dragged across the asphalt. His high beams turned it into a white wall, so he clicked them back to low, letting the road come to him in shorter, truer segments. The reflective paint on the center line gleamed, the cat's eyes in the pavement throwing back tiny sparks of light. He checked his mirrors. The world behind him was already shrinking, tail lights of a distant car smeared to a soft red smudge before vanishing altogether. The shoulders on either side were now just pale smears. The field fences, the maybe houses set way back on gravel drives, gone. The CB on the dash emitted a desultory hiss. Once in a while it pricked up with a stray voice, someone a county over saying something about road work, a bored night dispatcher reading out load numbers. But here, along this stretch, traffic was light and drivers were few. He nudged the volume up on the AM tuner. The static here was a different animal, grainier, with faint, distant voices buried so deep they might have been recordings from a forgotten decade. He moved the dial slowly, patiently, through the fuzz. At 780, a station from Chicago tried to claw its way through, drowning in weather. At 820, some late-night jazz breathed in for half a bar, then cut out. At 910, there was only a soft, senseless murmur like waves on a beach. Then, at 1310, the static smoothed. A soft piano chord drifted up out of the airwaves, melancholy and slow, followed by an old-fashioned male voice, warm and velvety as a well-worn jacket. And wherever you're running tonight, whether you're rolling 18 wheels, pushing a county cruiser, or just taking the long way home with the windows down, this hour's for you. You're tuned to station WXRH, the hollow hour bringing you company on the quiet miles, out here on the in-between. Mason's fingers stilled on the dial. The transmission was too clean for some tiny, underfunded late-night operation, too intimate for a big corporate station. The signal sat perfectly in the pocket, no fatting, no squeal, like it had been laid into the air just for this stretch of road. He frowned, thinking. He'd been running this route twice a week for months. He knew the local stations by name and quirk. WXRH wasn't one of them, and yet the call sign with that old radio rhythm sounded right somehow, as if he'd heard it once years ago, falling asleep in the backseat of his father's car, and then let it sink into the undersill of memory. On the radio, a soft vinyl crackle underpinned the piano, as though the station were playing from old records rather than servers. The host's voice came back in, pitched low like he was talking to someone right beside him. "Fog's layin' down heavy on 61 tonight," the man said. "A carpet of white, thick enough your high beams'll only blind you and your own thoughts'll start echoing back at you on delay." There was a smile in his tone, but not a mocking one. "Good night to check your mirrors. Good night not to stare too long into the places you can't quite see." Mason blinked, eyes flicking automatically to his side mirror and back. Neutral, just coincidence. Foggy nights were not rare this time of year. The host continued, voice settling into the cab like a familiar blanket. "We've got one truck out there in particular we're thinking about just now. Northbound, deep blue cab with a reefer on the hook, running a few pallets lighter than he thinks, but that's all right. Been rolling since just after sundown, couple cups of truck stop coffee in him, one radio for company, and an old ache in his left shoulder when the weather turns." The wheels seemed to get heavier under Mason's hands. The ache in his left shoulder, not pain, not exactly, just a dull line of awareness whenever the air turned damp, flared as if called. He flexed the joint reflexively. The host's tone did not change. He might have been reading a listener dedication off a card. "He's passing. Oh, how about mile marker 204 right about now, give or take a breath, and he's scanning the dial because the big city stations have burned out behind him, and the local ones are tucked up in bed. Mason's eyes dropped to the whip-thin green post slipping past on the right. 204. His throat went dry. He swallowed, the motion loud in the soft emptiness of the cab. The rational part of his mind hurried to assemble explanations. Maybe this was a prank, some pirate station run by a kid with a transmitter and too much time. Maybe there was a camera on a pole somewhere, picking license plates, cross-referencing dot numbers and feeding the operator details. Maybe. The host's voice flowed on, smooth and unhurried. He's got a girl back home named Leela who turned 8 last spring. She sent him off with a drawing taped to his fridge and a promise she'd wait up to watch the son come back with him on video chat. He's telling himself he'll make good on that he won't get hung up out here, not tonight. A spot behind Mason's ribs clenched. The drawing crayons, heavy on the purple, was indeed taped up in the little galley behind his seat, held in place with a magnet shaped like a smiling tomato. Lila and Dad on the road, the uneven letters proclaimed. The sun was drawn huge and golden, filling most of the page. He reached for the volume knob, intending to turn the station down. Then stopped halfway. Outside, the fog had thickened into something nearly physical. The world beyond the glass had become a silver tunnel with no walls and no roof. His low beams pushed the white away only a short distance, enough to show him the dull ribbon of asphalt, the glowing paint. The world had never felt so small, or so intimately tied to the sound pouring from the speakers. On WXRH, the piano faded, replaced by the gentle hiss of tape or vinyl between tracks. Then the host spoke again, his tone shifting just slightly, quieting. "Now Mason," he said, using the name like a hand laid carefully on a shoulder. Up ahead, this side of the river, the fog, sitting a little heavier around mile 219. You know how it likes to do down where the turf dips. And there's somebody coming southbound in a little sedan whose hands are more tired than they know. Their thoughts are 3 exits behind them, and they don't quite remember how long they've been awake. The words painted a picture behind Mason's eyes. A small car, dashboard clock glowing, driver's jaw cracked on a yawn. He'd seen them plenty of times. People who thought nothing of driving until their eyes blurred, because steel and mass and momentum didn't live in their bones the way it did in his. Most nights, the host went on gently, you'd all pass like ships and never know how close it got. Maybe you have a dozen times over. But tonight, the fog's drawn tight. The lines are slick. And there's a moment, no more than the space between heartbeats, where steel and glass and 40 tons of freight might try to share the same patch of Highway 61. A softness stole into his voice, the opposite of drama. Doesn't have to be that way, though. Not if you step sideways for a little while. Mason's right foot lightened on the accelerator without conscious thought. The speedometer's needle dipped from 62 to 55. Ahead, the tunnel of fog remained blank. No oncoming headlights glowed faintly in the distance. No hint of brake lights ahead suggested trouble. His heart thudded once, hard, then settled into a faster but not yet frantic rhythm. This stretch of roads got more than one story it can tell tonight, the host said. You don't have to be in the one where sirens show up late and paperwork gets filled out in fluorescent rooms. There's an old service turnout just shy of marker 217, one they never quite took off the books. Looks like a mistake on the map now if it shows up at all. Single sodium lamp, burned around the edges, pavement worn down to its bones. Signals say maintenance vehicles only, but you and I know that's more of a suggestion than a rule this time of night. Mason's palms were damp on the wheel. He flexed his fingers one at a time without taking his eyes off the road. Fog streamed silently over the hood. Droplets formed on the edges of the windshield, merging and sliding sideways in slow, heavy trails. He could almost hear his dispatcher's voice in his head, half amused, half exasperated. You're telling me you took a half-hour break at a ghost ramp because the radio told you to? Come on, Clark. On the speakers, the host's tone turned conspiratorial. Pull off there, give yourself a minute. Top up your coffee. Stare at something that's not white and moving. By the time you ease back out, if you take your time, that other story will have already been told and you won't be in it. Mason's gaze snagged on the GPS. It showed him as a tiny arrow on a featureless gray-green landscape, blue line bisecting nothing. No exits marked between 210 and the town that shared the highway number 10 miles ahead. No side roads. His hand hovered over the switch to change sources, to see if the station's feed showed up in any digital listing, any name. In the end, he left it where it was. Some part of him did not want to see WXRH appear in tidy text. It felt like something that should remain half uncertain. He whispered to the empty cab, "If this is a trick, it's a good one." At 216, he gripped the wheel harder, eyes scanning the pale world ahead for anything other than asphalt and white. The fog swirled and ebbed like slow water. The reflective posts along the shoulder appeared, then vanished. His wipers scraped once, then rested. Then there it was. Not a full-fledged exit, not the sweeping arc of an on and off ramp, but a narrower lane peeling off the highway at a sharper angle, its edges rougher, its paint faded. A single streetlight marked its mouth, haloed in fog. The bulb buzzed weakly, casting a sodium yellow puddle of light onto the worn pavement. A sign stood half concealed in the whiteness. Green, weathered, its reflective coating dull. Maintenance VHICLES only, it read, the letters slightly crooked, as if the sign had been taken down and put back up again by hands that weren't entirely certain. His turn signal ticked loud in the quiet cab as he clicked it on. The orange wink of it flashed on the fog, coloring a small slice of gray. Mason took a breath, deep and steady, feeling his ribs expand the way they used to before he climbed into a pool as a boy, committing to the cold. Then he steered the truck off the main line and onto the unmarked road. The surface here was rougher, the hum under his tires lower and more textured. The fog, if anything, grew thicker, curling up from ditches close on either side. Tall, shadowy shapes suggested trees leaning inward, their branches dripping with condensation. The road dipped in a gentle bowl, curving left around a stand of invisible trees. After a minute, too, time was hard to judge in the white. An opening yawned to the right. A little lot, barely more than an expanded apron of cracked asphalt, edged by a low, rusted rail. The lone streetlight from above spilled its tired glow over the space, revealing the dark outline of a small cinder-block building and a pair of long-disused dumpsters hunched like sleeping animals. Mason pulled in, rolling to a stop under the halo of light. He set his brakes. The truck shuddered once and went still. The engine idled with a familiar, companionable growl. He sat for a moment, hands still curved around the wheel, staring at the cinder-block shed. A metal door with peeling paint, a small, wired glass window dark and blank. No movement, no sign of current use. Yet the lot itself, though cracked, was free of weeds. The rail along its edge bore fresh scrapes of metal where something heavy had brushed it not too long ago. The radio's volume had slid down almost imperceptibly while he focused on the maneuver. Now, as if timed with the settling of his breath, the host's voice returned, softer, distant, like someone speaking from the far end of the room. "There you go," he said, satisfaction warm as a hand on a back. "That's it. Just step out of the stream for a spell. Let the river rush past without you." Soft guitar slid in underneath his words. An instrumental loop that might have been recorded in another century. A tune as simple and persistent as the sound of tires on asphalt. "While we're waiting," the host continued, "let's tip our hats to a few of the others who have taken the hollow turn now and then. You're in good company, Mason. You're never as alone out here as you think." A rustle of paper purely for effect, then a list of names. Some were plain Tom, Jenny, Mike, others longer with drawls folded into the syllables. With each, the host offered a few details, small and glancing. Tom and the old Peterbilt, who thought he could make another 100 miles on fumes until the fog decided otherwise. Adrienne, running back empty after a fight that stuck with her 3 states over. Big Joe, who always slowed at Black Creek, even though the bridge was rebuilt years ago. No dates, no causes, just hints of lives in motion, decisions made in the quiet between mile markers. Each mention landed in the cab like the soft thump of a book being added to a shelf somewhere unseen. Mason's hand drifted to the door handle before he consciously thought about it. The need to move, to put his boots on the ground, to feel the fog against his face like proof that the world existed beyond the cone of his headlights, pulled at him. He opened the door. Damp, cool air flowed in at once, smelling of wet pavement, leaf mulch, and something metallic and faintly sweet like old rain on rust. The fog here was not as blinding. Under the streetlight, it thinned into gauzy sheets, curling around the truck's wheels. His boots met asphalt with a hollow echo. The sound seemed to travel a shorter distance than usual before it was swallowed. The lot was small enough that with a few steps he could see its edges, the rail at the far side, the drop into pale nothing beyond. He walked a lazy circuit around the truck. Condensation beaded on the trailer's white sides, rolling down in slow tracks. The reefer unit muttered to itself, cycling. The tractor's exhaust blew in soft, regular puffs. Beyond the spill of the light, the fog formed a wall, dense and almost matte. No glow of headlights bled through it. No distant swish of passing cars reached his ears. Highway 61 might have dissolved entirely for all the evidence he had of it. Without quite thinking about it, he tilted his head. Somewhere far off yet eerily distinct, a siren wailed once, then again, the sound warped by distance and damp until it was more shape than tone. It did not build, did not rush nearer, just rose and fell in place like a memory of itself. On the radio, the host's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. "Sometimes the story goes on without us," he said. "Sometimes steel meets steel and glass gives way and the fog turns blue and red for a while. People walk away or they don't, and the road takes it all in and smooths itself over by morning. None of us can be in every story at once." Mason turned his face toward the fog wall, although there was nothing to see. Somewhere out there, maybe 4-5 miles up the highway, whatever had almost involved him was unfolding, had unfolded, would unfold. Time out here felt elastic, stretched and overlapping. He stood there, a tall, solid figure in a work jacket and worn jeans, breath ghosting faintly in front of him, until the siren's echo thinned and disappeared. The fog silence flowed back in, deep and soft. A faint taste of coffee lingered at the back of his tongue. He realized he was thirsty. Back in the cab, the thermos sat in its holder, half full. He climbed back up, closing the door with a muted thump. The cab felt even more like a cocoon now, its warmth gentle after the damp chill. The radio's soft guitar loop trailed off. The host returned to his easy patter, now about constellations invisible behind the cloud cover and late-night diners 3 states over serving hash browns to people whose lives he sketched with a handful of words. Mason sat for 10-15 minutes by the clock. He drank his coffee, fingers wrapped around the mug, watching the fog stroke the windshield. His heart rate slowed, the tightness in his shoulders unspooled by degrees. When he finally shifted back into gear and eased toward the entrance of the little lot, the host's voice followed him. "All right, Mason," he said, warmth threaded through with something like pride. "You've given it a little room. Slide on back when you're ready. The hollow will still be here the next night you need it. We always are." Mason pulled onto the narrow road, following its curve back up toward where he hoped the highway would be. The fog thickened for a few seconds, the world shrinking to his own hood ornament, to the strip of paint at the edge of the pavement. Then, with almost theatrical timing, the wall broke. Highway 61 appeared ahead, its lanes ghostly but clear enough. He merged smoothly, signal clicking, and pointed the nose north once more. The digital clock on the dash read 12:44. His logbook would later slot the unscheduled stop into the category of brief safety break, if he chose to note it at all. The GPS, for a moment, showed his arrow off any marked route, then snapped him back onto the line of the highway with a polite digital chime. On the radio, the station dipped into a low ad break, local-sounding spots for businesses in towns he'd never heard of, their names half familiar as if from a map printed before he was born. Then the music returned, slow and unobtrusive, and the host's voice came with it, now talking to someone running westbound in another state, another fog. Mason listened, attentive but no longer braced. Something in him had passed a small test of belief and come out the other side intact. At mile 222, the fog thinned noticeably. The fields on either side emerged, ghostly rows of corn stubble reaching away into the mist. The distant blink of a farmhouse's yard light winked at him through the gray. Traffic increased, one car, then a pickup, then an oncoming semi whose lights bloomed and receded with a quiet whoosh. Around 230, as the world regrew its edges, the station began to crackle. The host's words blurred into static between syllables. The piano gained a fizz of interference. Mason reached for the volume, thumb grazing the knob, not quite ready to let it go. "Remember out there in the in-between," the voice said, warping around a burst of noise. "You're never driven alone, not really. We'll be on this dial when the fog gets thick and the miles get long. WXRH Hollow Hour signing." The last word dissolved into a rising hiss. A sharp squeal of feedback lanced through, then even that smoothed out into the undifferentiated rush of empty frequency. When Mason turned the dial, careful, back and forth across the numbers, nothing like the station reappeared. Just the usual tumble of late-night voices, ads, and music, none of them wearing that particular worn cotton warmth. He kept the radio on, but lower, the rest of the way to the distribution center. The receiver's dock lights blinked at him from a distance as he approached, harsh white cutting through the last veils of lifting fog. Men in reflective vests moved briskly in and out of shadows. The ordinary machinery of early morning commerce spun back up around him. Hours later, with his trailer empty and his log updated, he sat in the break room with a paper cup of grayish coffee and a vending machine sandwich. A small TV in the corner muttered a local news broadcast. The anchor, bright-eyed despite the hour, read from the teleprompter. Authorities responded to a two-vehicle collision on Highway 61 near the Old River Cut just after midnight. Visibility was reduced due to heavy fog. No life-threatening injuries were reported, but both vehicles sustained significant damage. Phone footage played, a blurry smear of flashing lights, silhouettes of two vehicles nose to nose in the whiteout, one much larger than the other. The anchor's voice overlaid. Drivers are reminded to take extra caution or delay travel when conditions deteriorate. Mason watched in silence. The camera, panning poorly, caught a green mile marker for a fraction of a second, 219. The coffee tasted suddenly more real in his mouth, bitter and hot. He swallowed, setting the cup down gently. No life-threatening injuries, the voice had said. The story had played out, but the last chapter had been kinder than it might have been. Still, he was not in it. Somewhere, in whatever quiet ledger the Hollow Hour kept, his name had been filed under a different column. In the weeks that followed, whenever fog began to creep along the ditches or river valleys, he found his hand drifting almost automatically to the AM dial. He spun slowly through the noise, listening for that particular hush, that piano, that voice. Sometimes all he heard was static and distant ball games. Sometimes preachers, sometimes talk shows. Sometimes, on nights when the fog was only patchy and thin, he did not try at all. But once in a while, when the world outside shrank to a tunnel and the white pressed close against the glass, the static would smooth out, and a warm, velvety voice would murmur from the speakers, "Good evening, night runners." Wherever you're rolling, there's room on this frequency for you. He never heard his own name again. The hollow hour had other stories to tend, other small nudges to offer in the dark. But every time its signal slipped into his cab, the road ahead felt a little less empty, and the fog seemed less like something waiting to swallow him, and more like a curtain someone kind was helping him part, one slow, careful mile at a time. Story number 4. The last exit before the causeway glowed behind Vincent hand like a little island of color in the rearview mirror. Gas station canopy lights, red and blue logos, the familiar rectangle of a truck stop sign standing tall against the low coastal sky. Then his rig rolled past the final on-ramp, and all of it fell away into the dark. Ahead, the bridge lifted out of the marsh like a pale ribbon, its entrance guarded by a pair of overhead gantries. Green signs hung from them, washed out to near white in his headlights. Causeway next 24 miles, no shoulders. Fog and high winds possible. The smaller sign beneath had a more recent look, its reflective coating crisp. Turn back now if conditions unsafe. He eased the tanker through the toll sensors. The gates here were all electronic now. A transponder on his windshield blinked its acknowledgement in a soft green that matched the dash lights. Beyond the gantry, the 4 lanes narrowed gently, climbing up onto the concrete spine that ran across black water and low, flooded flats. Vin shook out his shoulders, rolling his neck until he heard a quiet click. His truck's cab was a little fortress of muted light and familiar sounds, the steady hum of the diesel under his feet, the faint whine of the turbo when he rolled on the throttle, the occasional comforting clink from the stainless steel tanker slung behind him. The late-night traffic on the approach had been light. Now, as he rose onto the bridge proper, he felt the quiet deepen, the space around him expanding. Outside, the world was a study in grays. The remnants of the day's warmth leaked up from the water, meeting cooler air sliding in from the Gulf. Fog budded along the causeway's low guardrails, little tufts of white that clung and then tumbled away into the dark. The moon was somewhere above the overcast, a vague suggestion of brightness that never quite broke through. The sky pressed low, cloud and fog blending at the horizon until up and down blurred. Vin glanced at the digital clock inset in the dash. 2:19. His logbook would note the time with tidy precision, but up here, time felt thinner, stretched across long, even miles. The first real patch of fog rolled across the lanes like a living thing, no longer wisps but a solid band. His headlights struck it and turned it into a white wall for a heartbeat before his truck cut through. On the far side, the air was sharper, the pavement gleaming faintly from earlier rain. A lone buoy bell out on the flats clanged once, a hollow, distant note. He flicked his eyes to the side mirror. The shore he'd left was already gone, swallowed in gray. Even the orange wink of the last exit sign had vanished. Only the faint glow of his trailer's running lights remained, twin strips of red framed in fog. He reached forward and clicked on the CB, the old mic swinging gently on its coil. The speaker hissed softly, filling the cab with a low, restless whisper. "Any westbound on the Hanley Causeway tonight?" he asked, voice level, more for the comfort of another sound than out of real expectation. "This is Silver Line Tanker 304, just cleared the toll." Static stretched for a few seconds, that particular empty hush of airwaves with nobody close. Then, faint and distant, a voice crackled through. 304, you're about the only fool out there right now, someone said, with a chuckle more tired than unkind. Fog's thickening up past the 3-mile marker. You keep your eyes on the cats and your hands loose. Vin smiled slightly despite himself. "Copy that," he replied. "I'll take all the advice I can get." He turned the volume down a hair but left the CB open. The AM/FM, already low, murmured nothing useful, scanning fruitlessly for a station that would hold. Out here, in the middle stretch between small cities, even the big clear-channel broadcasters sometimes dissolved. The bridge settled into its rhythm. Every 50 or so feet, The tires thumped softly over expansion joints, a gentle, repetitive marking of distance. Outside, the guardrails were low concrete, painted once upon a time but now mostly just pale in his beams. Beyond them, there was nothing visible but the pitch-black hint of water and the thickening white. The fog did not descend in one dramatic gesture. It crept, layer upon layer. 10 minutes into the crossing, it had gathered itself into a low-lying bank that hugged the bridge from below. Wisps curled up through the railings, then overlapped until they met above the roadway, knitting into a soft, luminous ceiling. Vin flicked his high beams on for a second, saw them throw solid white back into his face and flicked them off again. Low beams, fog lights. The world became a tunnel, 2 lanes, a strip of paint, rails, and a roof of glowing mist. Everything else, shore, sky, horizon, gone. Sound changed with it. The engine noise grew muted, as if thick walls had risen on either side of the cab. The usual distant rush of other vehicles, opposite lanes, parallel traffic on other approaches, disappeared. The bridge felt suddenly like a separate place, cut loose from the mainland's background noise. He clicked his window down 2 inches. Damp air flowed in, cool against his skin, carrying the faint, clean tang of brackish water and something metallic and old from the bridge's structure. The fog that surged through the cracks settled instantly on the inside of the glass, beating in tiny droplets. The CB hissed on, a subtle companion. Then, cutting through the static with startling clarity, another voice sounded. This one was crisp, measured, threaded with the kind of practiced calm heard from dispatchers and control tower operators. "All units on Hanley Causeway, this is Bridge Control," it said. "Dense fog advisory now in effect from Marker 3 to Marker 20. Reduce speed to 35 and maintain lane. Repeat, maintain lane. Do not attempt to pass. Confirm receipt." Vin's eyes went to the small blue sign that loomed up on the right. 3 miles in. Somehow he'd slipped that far already. He frowned slightly. Bridge Control. The new causeway system, tolls collected electronically, cameras on the gantries, whether sensors feeding into some far-off central database, didn't use that term anymore. The old concrete tower that had loomed near the midpoint, windows flickering with fluorescent light, had been shuttered years ago. He'd seen it himself in daylight, squat, empty, its glass scabbed with salt, antenna spars ragged. He thumbed the mic. "Bridge Control, this is Silver Line 304 at Marker 3, he said slowly. "Copy fog advisory, reducing speed to 35. For a beat, only static. Then, 304 Bridge Control has you. Continue westbound. You'll link up with Escort 7 just ahead. Follow their lead. They'll bring you through the densest band." Escort 7. Vin let the word sit in his head for a second. On some mountain passes, in some gnarly winter storms, DOT would send pilot vehicles to guide convoys through. But here, on this ocean-level stretch of concrete, if they'd started that, he hadn't heard about it. Still, he could feel the fog getting thicker under his wheels, the world beyond his bumper shrinking. He let his rig ease down, speedometer needle settling a hair below 35. The tanker swayed once, responding to a whisper of crosswind from nowhere, then steadied. A glow appeared ahead, muted but distinct amber, not red or white. It bobbed in the fog like a lantern, growing slowly larger. As he drew nearer, it resolved itself into a revolving beacon mounted on the roof of a pickup-sized silhouette. The vehicle emerged fully when he was almost on top of it. An older model truck, boxy and low, paint maybe white or pale gray under the film of weather. Its hazard lights blinked in synchronous rhythm with the amber beacon. On the tailgate, a reflective panel spelled out Bridge Escort in block letters that looked a little faded at the edges. Beneath that, 7. Vin's grip tightened slightly on the wheel. The truck held a perfect 35, centered in the right lane. After a long second, just enough to feel like it was looking back at him, it flashed its hazards twice, a slow double wink. He thumbed the CB again. "Escort 7, "This is Silver Line 304 behind you," he said. "You got room for one more." There was a short pause, during which he could hear, faintly, the soft whoosh of his own tires on wet concrete, the distant clank of a buoy bell. Then a man's voice, coming through on the same channel as bridge control, low and steady. "Morning 304, the driver said. "You're right on my bumper like you've been there the whole time. Fall in, keep 2 dashes of paint between us, and don't outrun your lights. We'll get you across." The tone in the man's words had that particular ease of someone for whom guiding in bad weather was less a job and more a nightly ritual. Slight drawl, but not deep. Older, 40, 50 maybe. No edge of nerves. Vin settled the rig behind the Escort, giving himself a buffer he could measure with his eyes. 1, 2 centerline dashes between his bumper and the other truck's tailgate. The fog swirled around them, thick but somehow held at bay by the pools of their lights. "Appreciate it," he replied. "Didn't realize we had Escort service on the causeway now." A soft huff of breath came over the radio, something between amusement and nostalgia. "We don't most nights," the man said. "Only when it soups in like this. We run a few across, keep folks honest. Fog likes to push people together who'd be better off with a little space between them." As if in answer, the air around them grew more opaque. Beyond the amber beacon and Vin's own headlights, the world went to milk. The guardrail vanished completely. The sky vanished. Even the faint suggestion of water beyond the concrete's edge disappeared. The only sure things left were the truck ahead of him, glowing in amber and red, and the white-green glow of his own dash. He'd driven in fog plenty of times before. Mountain fog, river fog, the kind that clung low over fields until dawn burned it away. This felt different, not thicker exactly, but more complete, a perfect lack of distance. He found himself listening more intently, as though his ears could make up for his eyes. The expansion joints ticked beneath him in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Somewhere below, too far to be seen but close enough to suggest its presence, water lapped against concrete pilings with quiet, slapping sounds. Once, far off in the whiteness, a ship's horn blew, low and long, its location impossible to trace. Ahead, Escort 7's brake lights glowed faintly, then eased off, a gentle check before a curve Vin couldn't see. He followed the movement like a dance partner, letting the other vehicle's subtle adjustments translate into his own. "Not much traffic tonight," Vin said after a while, more to puncture the silence than anything. "Where everybody go?" "Oh, they're out there," the Escort driver answered. "Some made it across before this settled. Some haven't left the diner yet. Some turned back at the toll when they saw the inside of the sky." A pause. Some try to play it brave and keep running solo. We try to catch as many as we can." The phrasing was odd, but his tone was gentle, not ominous. Vin pictured, unbidden, a small car in this whiteness, high beams on, bouncing useless light back at the windshield. How easy it would be to drift just a few inches over the center line, to not realize the arc of a curve until too late. "How far you taking me?" he asked. "To the end," the man replied simply. "Wouldn't do to let you go in the middle. Fog's got its own ideas about where the middle is." They drove 5 miles, 10. The instrument panel's odometer rolled along in tidy digits, but distance lost some of its weight. Every span of concrete sounded like the last. Every breath of wind felt like an echo. Vin's muscles, at least, recognized the value of the small, boxy beacon in front of him. His shoulders loosened by a notch or two. The constant micro-tension of alone in the fog driving, eased by the knowledge that someone else was feeling the edges first. At marker 12, a stronger gust shouldered the side of the tanker, pushing it half a foot toward the left lane before his grip caught and corrected. The fog, too, shifted, a subtle, sideways tumble that made the whole world feel like it had slid an inch. Ahead, Escort 7's hazards flared twice in warning. The CB crackled. "Wind picks up in the teens," the driver said. We're hitting the high stretch where she's a little more naked to the Gulf. There's an emergency bay a half-mile ahead. We're gonna duck in, let this burst wander past. Copy. Copy, Vin said. Emergency bay. Yeah, little splay out on the right. Old maintenance pull-off. Dot doesn't bother with it on their brochures. There was that not quite chuckle again. You'll see the lamp before you see the rail. Vin nodded automatically, though the man couldn't see him. His eyes scanned the blur of white on the right, looking for a break, a difference in texture. For a long, blank stretch, there was nothing but fog. Then, almost apologetically, an orange stain appeared in the mist. Sodium light, less harsh than LED, its glow spread and softened. The bay opened like the palm of a hand, just big enough for 2 trucks' nose to tail. Escort 7 eased into it with habitual ease. Vin followed, feeling the slight pitch as his right tires rolled onto the splayed concrete, the bridge's subtle vibrations changing tone beneath him. He set his brakes. The amber beacon ahead continued its slow revolution, painting the fog in moving bands of honeyed light. Out here, off the main lanes, the sense of being in some separate pocket of the world intensified. He cracked his window further. Wind worried at the edge of it, bringing with it the smell of wet concrete and salt, and the faint, sharp tang of hot breaks from some remembered passage. The bay's single street lamp hummed, its buzzing underscored by the deep, structural hum of the bridge itself, that low, constant vibration of concrete and steel holding against water and wind. Vin leaned forward, peering through the glass at the escort truck. In the pool of light, he could see more details now. The rounded edges of an older body style, a dot logo on the door so faded it was more shape than sign, a call number stencil on the fender that matched the 7 on the tailgate. No company branding, no web address. Appreciate the stop, he said into the mic. Didn't think they kept these pull-offs active anymore. For most folks, they don't, the driver answered. Budget cuts, automated systems, you know how it goes. But some bits of road remember what they were built for, even if the paperwork forgets. Don't take much to flick the lights back on when the weather calls for it. The phrasing sat oddly in Vin's mind. Built for. He cast his memory back to things he'd heard at truck stop counters and in drivers' lounges, old-timers talking about the causeway. There had been a story, years back, about a foggy night and a chain reaction wreck, vehicles piled up like toys across lanes. He'd been a kid then, catching pieces of grown-up conversation on the evening news. Been running this bridge long? He asked. Long enough to know her moods, came the reply. Long enough to know that on some nights, if you don't talk folks through the white, they start hearing their own thoughts too loud. Long enough to remember when the tower on the hump was still manned and the radios had knobs instead of buttons. Vin's fingers brushed, without thinking, over the smooth plastic of his CB controls. Thought they closed that tower years ago. They did, the driver said easily. Locked the doors, turned off the fluorescents, rolled up the cables. But a place doesn't go quiet just because someone shuts the lights. Sound has a way of lingering. Voices, too. Wind rattled the guardrail of the bay, a low, hollow drumming. Far off to the right, beyond the edge of everything visible, a wave slapped something solid and heavy. The air thickened with a sudden swirl of colder mist, then eased again. On the CB, the driver inhaled once audibly. Whiteout patch ahead around 16, he said. Drops heavier there. Radar don't see it right. When we roll back out, I want you on low beams only. When I tell you kill even those, trust the tail lights. Your eyes'll lie to you in that pocket. Kill his lights. Every training instinct Vin had rebelled slightly at the thought, yet he'd driven in enough strange conditions to know that sometimes the unnatural thing was the safe thing. In snowstorms, sometimes dim was better. In dense smoke, sometimes you followed the road by its feel under the tires. Copy, he said quietly. I'll follow your call. They waited another few minutes. The wind's teeth dulled. The fog around the bay loosened fractionally, going from clotted to merely thick. In Vin's mirrors, the lanes of the causeway appeared as pale streaks, empty, vanishing into gray in both directions. Escort 7's amber beacon clicked off, plunging the bay into softer, fixed light from the street lamp. The other truck's brake lights brightened. "All right, 304, the man said. "Let's take her the rest of the way." They eased back onto the bridge, the transition from bay to lane almost imperceptible to the eye but clear in the feel of the rig, more vibration, more subtle sway under the concrete's length. The fog seemed to close behind them, reclaiming the little pull-off without a trace. For a mile or two, visibility held at its previous dubious level. 30, 40 feet of clear roadway ahead, maybe a suggestion of rails. Then, without transition, it was as if someone had poured milk into the world. The white thickened until it became nearly opaque. The amber point of the escort's beacon dulled. Water droplets whispered more insistently at the edges of the windshield. "Lights," the driver's voice came, calm but precise. "Parking only, no beams now." Vin clicked the stalk down. His low beams winked off, taking with them the familiar cone of illumination. For a terrifying half-second, he saw almost nothing. Not the lane, not the rail, just a blank field of white lit faintly from nowhere. Then his eyes adjusted. The amber glow ahead resolved more clearly, no longer drowned in competing light. His own parking lights cast a soft, close halo around the hood, just enough to give his brain a reference for the truck's immediate presence. Beyond that, the bridge felt like an idea rather than a structure, held together by memory and the faintest suggestion of painted lines. "Feels wrong, I know," the escort driver murmured. "But look how far you can see me now. That's the trick with this kind of fog. Your own light throws it back in your face. You want to see what's beyond you, sometimes you gotta stop staring at yourself." The metaphor landed in Vin's mind with a weight it might not have had in clearer weather. He fixed his gaze on the twin red rectangles and the slow spin of amber ahead, letting the tiny perceptible movements guide him. More to the left, more to the right, slight break, gentle roll. The bridge under his tires felt different in this blind patch, its usual hum overlaid with a faint, irregular vibration, as if they were passing over a section that had been patched and repatched over years. Somewhere, out in the whiteness, a horn blew, a sharp, short double blast from another vehicle, close enough to be unnerving, never materializing into visible form. Then, as abruptly as they'd entered it, they were out. The fog thinned in a breath, going from wall to vale. Streetlights from the far shore's approaches glowed dimly ahead, faint yellow pearls on a blurred string. "All right," the driver said quietly. "Bring your lights back, 304. Vin clicked his low beams on. The lanes and rails sprang back into vivid existence. The world expanded by 100 feet. Ahead, the escort truck kept its unhurried, exact pace. Its silhouette was clearer now. The logo on its door and his lights sharpened just enough that he could make out the ghost of lettering, HANLEY Bridge Authority, white on once blue. There, been no authority for years. The bridge fell now under some larger, folded-in department. They rolled the last miles in relative ease, the fog continuing to thin as they approached land. On the right, a navigation channel marker emerged, red light blinking patiently over dark water. On the left, a row of small lights threaded along a distant shoreline, houses, a marina, the low curve of a road. Vin's chest loosened in increments he hadn't realized were tight. The bridge's slight crown leveled, then dipped toward the far toll gantries. Signs loomed out of the gray. Exit 1, BAYPORT/terminal. Speed limit 55. Escort 7's brake lights brightened as they approached the toll sensors on this side. The little truck drifted slightly to the right, angling toward a narrow, unmarked lane between the main arrays. Vin thumbed the CB one last time. "Appreciate the lead, 7, he said. "Didn't know I needed it until I did." The other driver's reply carried a smile that seeped out around the words. "That's usually how it goes," he said. You keep it between the rails, 304. If you hear us again, answer. Fog doesn't much like folks crossing alone. Then, as the first beams of the toll's camera system sliced through the air, the escort truck slipped into the densest patch of mist near the shoulder and was simply gone. No fatting taillights, no turnoff. One instant, its beacon still revolved in the gray. The next, there was only the empty lane and the approaching glow of the plaza. Vin coasted through the toll. The transponder blinked, the system logging his passage. As he descended the short ramp onto solid ground, the fog thinned another full degree. The sodium glare of a truck stop canopy 2 exits ahead lit the low sky like dawn far too early. He pulled off at the first service plaza on instinct more than intent, following the curve of the ramp into a wide, mostly empty lot. The world here felt suddenly large again. Signs, buildings, other parked rigs people by their absence. He set his brakes near the far edge and sat for a long moment, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the low burble of the truck idling. Inside the plaza, the light was harsh and slightly humming, the coffee lukewarm and comforting in its own way. A couple of other drivers hunched at tables, eyes on phones or far away. A small television over the cashier's station ran a local news channel with the sound off. As Vin paid for his cup, he ventured, to no one in particular, fog was something on the bridge tonight. The cashier, a man in his 50s with a thinning ponytail, nodded absently. Hanley does that some nights, he said. Swallows you whole if you let it. An older driver at a nearby table looked up at that, eyes creased at the corners. You get a pilot? He asked. Vin hesitated. Yeah, he said, deciding quietly that he could say it out loud. Escort 7, little white or gray truck, amber light, brought me most of the way. The older man's gaze sharpened. You sure about that number? Pretty sure, Vin said. Tailgate said 07. Door had some old logo, Hanley Bridge Authority or something like it. The man sat back slowly, a small, rueful huff of breath leaving him. Haven't had official pilots on that bridge since before my rookie year, he said. Shut the tower down after the big pileup in '89. Fella running Escort 7 back then, he shook his head once. Well, he didn't make it home from his last run. Fog got too thick, folks didn't listen, and he was in the wrong place at the wrong time trying to wave him off. Truck went over. They say he kept calling warnings on the radio till the batteries gave. The cashier made a non-committal noise, the kind that lives half in superstition, half in routine. The older driver studied Vin's face. You sure you weren't just following your own headlights in your mirrors? He asked, voice gentle, not mocking. Vin pictured the amber halo in the fog, the old stencil on the fender. The way the other driver's voice had carried the calm of long practice. He thought of the patch of road where he'd killed his lights and driven by someone else's dim glow. Pretty sure, he said again quietly. Back in his truck, curiosity nagged at him. He thumbed through the dash cam's recorded clips on the small screen, fast-forwarding to the timestamp that matched his entry onto the bridge. Grainy black and white footage rolled by, empty lanes disappearing into haze, the faint impression of his own headlights on the fog. When the time came where he remembered the escort's beacon swinging ahead, the camera showed only white and the suggestion of concrete rails. No other taillights, no small truck. His own voice on the audio track spoke into the CB, half of a conversation, drifting in and out around the rumble of the engine. Behind you, you got room for one more. How far you taking me? Copy, lights off then. The replies to the camera's tiny microphone were only static and the distant thrum of the bridge. He sat in the driver's seat with the ignition off, cab dim, listening to the faint rush of traffic on the nearby interstate. Dawn was still hours away, but the eastern edge of the sky had lifted a shade, fog glowing softly under the promise of it. He filed the footage away without deleting it. Proof of something, or perhaps proof of nothing. The logbook entry for the crossing remained as simple as ever. Toll Plaza A to Toll Plaza B, 24 miles, 35-45 mph due to dense fog. In the weeks that followed, whenever he approached Hanley Causeway on a clear night, the bridge looked exactly as it did on any postcard: long, low line of lamps, water black and still beneath. The old control tower on the hump sat hollow, dark windows facing the wind. No escort trucks waited at its base. Only on certain nights, when fog boiled up from the flats and the sky came down to meet it, did he find his hand drifting toward the CB as he eyed the first blue mile marker. Only then did he catch himself listening, very carefully, for a voice that might crackle in, threaded with the easy patience of someone who had been running that stretch for longer than the paperwork said he could. And on those nights, if the fog truly folded thick around his cab and the rails vanished into cotton, he kept his speed at 35, left 2 dashes of paint between himself and whatever might be ahead, and trusted that if he needed it, amber light would find him in the white. Story number 5. By midnight, the pines along Route 47 had closed in so tightly that the world outside Caleb Monroe's windshield felt more like a tunnel than a road. The 2-lane cut through the forest in a ruler straight line, dark trunks marching past on either side, their tops lost in a sky that had long since swallowed the stars. His rig's headlights carved out a narrow corridor of pale light, cracked asphalt, white centerline, the occasional glint of a culvert pipe under the shoulder. Beyond that, the forest was nothing but a dense, shifting wall of shadow, the kind of night where distance meant less than direction, and both were swallowed by the sheer sameness of the trees. Inside the cab, the dashboard glowed in comforting colors, muted greens and ambers, numbers steady, gauges sitting where they belonged. Caleb's thermos sat in the cup holder, its metal warm against his knuckles when he reached for it. The air smelled faintly of coffee, worn vinyl, and the clean, sharp edge of pine resin that had wormed its way in whenever he'd rolled the window down earlier in the evening. He was tired in that deep, behind-the-eyes way that came from long hours of concentration rather than pure lack of sleep. The shipper had held him longer than planned, a small-town back dock with its own peculiar rhythm, where everyone knew each other and time stretched. He'd left 2 hours behind schedule, promising himself he'd make it up on the road. Now, somewhere between logging towns whose lights he'd last seen in his mirrors an hour ago, the idea of making it up felt thinner. The miles were sliding past, but so was his focus, one small degree at a time. He checked the dash clock, 12:08 a.m. On the GPS, the blue arrow of his truck inched along a green line that cut straight through an expanse of dark nothing. A tiny icon blinked on the edge of the screen, 20 miles ahead. Rest area, 24 HR. He remembered the sign from the last time he'd run this route. A small turnout in the middle of nowhere, 2 or 3 truck slots if you squeezed. It hadn't looked like much, but right now even a hollow square of pavement felt like an anchor. He keyed the CB, more out of habit than expectation. Any eastbound on 47, he said, his voice low, the cab swallowing sound. This is Cape Runner pulling a box toward Green. How's the fog up ahead? Forecast said it might get thick near the creek. Static hissed back at him, soft and even. No one answered. It didn't surprise him. Most of the company ran the interstate these days, following the big, lit arteries. This older route was for when dispatch wanted to shave miles, or when someone like him simply preferred a quieter road. He thumbed the radio off and let the silence settle again, broken only by the hum of the engine, the whisper of tires, and the occasional creak from the trailer behind him. The first hint of fog came as a pale sheen along the ground, crawling out from the darkness between the trees. Wisps slid across the pavement like low smoke, catching the headlights and then dissolving in the wake of the truck. The air outside his window grew softer, edges losing their crispness. He slowed a few miles an hour, just enough that the change in the engine's pitch was more felt than heard. His hands shifted on the wheel, finding that extra degree of readiness that came whenever anything other than dry, open road slipped into the picture. More fog gathered. In the hollows between rises in the land, it lay thicker, pooling white in depressions, hugging the ground in an uneven, shifting blanket. The trees' lower trunks blurred. Reflective signs took on halos, their messages swimming in the mist for a second before snapping into clarity as he passed. A green board emerged ahead, wavering faintly in the silvered air. Rest area 5 miles. A little symbol of a tree and a picnic table beneath. Caleb's shoulders eased a fraction. 5 miles. 10 minutes, maybe less. He could pull in, set his brakes, let his eyes stop vibrating in their sockets. This stretch of wood and fog was starting to feel like it could go on forever. He took a sip from his thermos. The coffee had cooled, but the taste was familiar, grounding. He watched the odometer creep forward, marking off the distance in steady half miles. The fog thickened almost imperceptibly, then all at once. What had been wisps became bands. What had been bands became a near-solid wall. It rose from the ditches and flowed down from the invisible canopy on a shared tide, swallowing headlights, shoulder, and any sense of horizon. His world shrank to a smeared tunnel, 20, 30 feet of pavement ahead, the white centerline a wavering reference. He flicked on his fog lights, the low beam cutting across the ground, illuminating the fine, swirling texture of the air. Sound, too, changed. The engine's growl grew muffled, the whir of the tires on damp pavement more pronounced. The night beyond the truck went from open and indifferent to close and intent, a thick presence pressing in from all sides. He scanned for the rest area's next sign, feeling for it in the way time passed. When the 5 minutes he'd mentally allotted had come and gone, unease tightened lightly between his shoulder blades. The green sign appeared eventually, emerging from the white like a memory made visible. Rest area 1 mile. An arrow pointed to the right. He exhaled slowly, a breath he hadn't meant to hold. The intersection icon on the GPS brightened, too, as though in confirmation. Up ahead, the faint black cut of an access road began to suggest itself in the blur. The turnoff materialized almost suddenly, the fog hiding it until he was nearly on top of it. A short, gentle curve peeled off the main highway, flanked by reflectors that glowed dully in his beams. He put on his blinker, a rhythmic sound in the cab, and eased the truck onto the exit lane. As he climbed the shallow ramp, the fog rose with him. For a second, the world contracted further, everything beyond his hood a blank white. Then the pavement leveled and shapes emerged. The rest area was small, a simple loop of cracked asphalt around a central island of unkempt grass and 3 tall pines. A single street lamp stood near the entrance, its sodium orange light smearing across the mist. A low brick building squatted in the middle, bathrooms, maybe a few vending machines. 2 picnic tables sat off to one side, their surfaces beaded with moisture. There were no other vehicles, no cars, no trucks. The lot lay empty, the parking lines faint but still visible. Caleb pulled into one of the longer slots, nose pointed toward the outbound lane, habits of quick departure ingrained. He set his brakes. The truck shuddered once, then went still. The engine's rumble idled down, filling the silence like a cat's purr in a hollow room. For a moment he simply sat, hands still on the wheel, watching the fog coil around the street lamp. It moved in slow, serpentine currents, the light turning it into a living thing. He glanced at the dash clock, 12:31 a.m. The urge to step outside, to feel the cool air and stretch muscles stiffened by hours in the seat, tugged at him. He opened the door. Night air flowed in at once, damp and cold, smelling of wet asphalt, pine, and the faint mineral scent of the nearby creek unseen in the dark. His boots hit the pavement with a dull, close sound, as if the fog had wrapped itself around his ankles and muffled his steps. The world beyond the circle of his truck's running lights, and the lone street lamp was a soft, depthless white. He walked a slow circle around the rig, fingers grazing the trailer's side as he went. Moisture had gathered there in a fine layer, beading on the metal in tiny, trembling droplets. The reefer unit hummed calmly, a small comfort in the fog. Up close, the rest area's building looked older than he'd expected. The brick was darkened by age and damp, mortar lines softened. A metal sign near the door announced RESTROOMS in flaked white letters. Another, beneath it, read vending in the same tired paint. The glass in the narrow windows reflected fog and the distant glow of his truck's clearance lights, offering nothing of the interior. He tried the door. It resisted for a second, then gave with a slight groan. Inside, harsh fluorescent light buzzed overhead, turning the small tiled hallway into a tunnel of humming brightness. The restroom was clean enough, smelling faintly of disinfectant and something sweeter, orange hand soap maybe. No graffiti, no evidence of recent use. On the opposite wall, 3 vending machines stood like quiet sentries, one for drinks, one for snacks, one with a faded label that read MAPS and GUIDEBOOKS. Coins and bills only, the instructions said, in fonts a decade out of date. No card readers, no tap pads. The snack machine's glass was clouded with a fine film of condensation, obscuring the contents into a generalized blur of bright packaging. He didn't really want anything from them. He stood there a moment anyway, listening to the buzz of the lights and the faint, almost imperceptible ticking of cooling metal somewhere in the walls. The building felt suspended, like a place waiting to wake up. He washed his face in the restroom's cold water, the shock of it clearing some of the fuzz at the edges of his thoughts. When he stepped back outside, the fog had thickened further, creeping closer to the circle of the street lamp as if drawn to the light. He checked his watch. 10 minutes gone, maybe 15. Enough to have broken the run of monotony, not enough to cost him the morning delivery window. Back in the cab, the seat welcomed him with familiar contours. He closed the door with a soft thump, and the cab became its own small world again. The dash clock still read 12:31 a.m. He frowned. He'd been inside more than a minute, clearly. Time in the rest area had had a weight to it. He tapped the plastic above the digits lightly with his knuckle. The numbers did not change. Probably just a glitch. Electronics hiccup sometimes. He'd had the clock freeze once in winter and then leap forward sporadically. His wristwatch, when he checked it, read 12:46. That felt more right. He turned the key. The engine caught with its usual eager rumble. The gauges jumped, then settled. The GPS threw up a little signal reacquired message, then slid his truck icon back onto the main route. As he steered out of the slot and circled the loop toward the exit, the rest area's emptiness pressed at the corners of his perception. No wrappers drifted across the pavement. No insects battered themselves against the lamp. Even the pines in the median stood unnervingly still, their needles barely trembling despite the damp clinging to them. He guided the truck down the gentle ramp, back toward the highway. The fog at the mouth of the exit felt thicker, swirling in sluggish eddies as his headlights pushed into it. For a breathless second, he saw nothing beyond white. Then the dark ribbon of Route 47 appeared, centerline bright in his low beams. He signaled, merged, and let the truck roll back up to speed. The expansion of motion felt good. The rest area receded into the mirrors, its lone light smearing into a faint smudge before vanishing entirely. The miles clicked by. Trees, fog, road. A pattern so simple it became complex again. Caleb sipped his coffee, flexed his fingers around the wheel now and then, tuned his hearing to the small variances in engine note that told him everything was as it should be. After a while, he checked the clock again. 12:31 a.m. The unease this time was sharper. It unfurled slowly like smoke from the center of his chest. His eyes flicked from the frozen digits to the wristwatch on his left hand. 1:07 a.m. He looked at the odometer. Since leaving the rest area, he'd logged nearly 30 miles. The trees had not all looked the same. A small service road had crossed beneath the highway at one point, a concrete underpass where he'd seen the ghost of other headlights far below. He was not circling in place. And yet, a faint green shape emerged in the fog ahead. He leaned forward slightly, gaze tightening. The sign resolved into words, Rest Area 5 MILES. He stared at it as his truck slipped past, heart giving a slow, incredulous beat. For a long moment he considered the possibilities. Another rest area, unlikely this close to the first. A sign for a facility on the opposite side of the road. The directional arrow had pointed right, same as before. Road departments sometimes made errors. He'd seen speed limit signs left from old zoning, exits misnumbered. Besides, fog had a way of playing tricks, making familiar shapes into strangers. He drove on. The fog did not thin. It bunched and unbunched, its density changing in subtle ways, but the world remained compressed to its narrow tunnel of visibility. The CB, when he flicked it back on, gave him only static with the occasional, distant crackle of voices too far away to understand. At last the next sign appeared, Rest Area 1 mile, same shape, same font, same little tree and picnic table icon, their silhouettes softened by mist. His pulse picked up. On the GPS, the same tiny icon blinked, exactly as it had before, 20, then 10, then 5 miles out. The map software insisted he was continuing along Route 47, no deviation, no loop. The exit lane opened on the right. Ahead, the vague rise of a ramp. He could ignore it, drive on, chalk the whole thing up to coincidence. A trick of signage, a foggy night and a tired brain. His hands moved almost of their own accord. The blinker clicked, amber light pulsing faintly in the white. He steered the truck onto the ramp. The geometry of the curve was the same. Gentle climb, slight left bend at the top. Fog pressed against the windshield. The sodium-orange glow appeared ahead, suffusing the mist. The rest area came into view. Same loop of cracked asphalt. Same 3 pines in the median. Same low, brick building with its narrow windows and dark glass. Same lone street lamp casting its tired light over the empty lot. But not quite the same. The details had shifted half a degree. The pines seemed taller, their trunks thicker, bark darker. The building's brick was a slightly different shade, warmer, as if it had been cleaned more recently. The sign by the door was no longer metal with flacking paint, but newer plastic with raised white letters, RESTROMS. The vending machine silhouettes behind the narrow windows glowed more distinctly. He pulled into the same slot, his tires fitting neatly into the tired grooves of repeated parking. Set his brakes. Sat there, listening to the tick of cooling discs, the low hum of the engine idling. The dash clock said 12:31 a.m. His watch said 1:19. The fog outside the cab seemed to crowd closer, becoming less an absence of things and more a presence of its own. The edges of the truck's running lights blurred. The world beyond them receded. He thought of stories he'd heard from older drivers at rest stops and terminal tables. Loops and repeats. Segments of highway that seemed to stretch on longer than could be accounted for by the speedometer. Places where time and distance got into arguments with each other. He had never entirely believed them. He did not entirely believe this, even as he opened his door again and stepped down into the cool, damp air. The rest area smelled faintly different, less of old stone and more of cleaning products, a sharp lemon undercurrent. In the distance, the creek he knew must be out there somewhere gurgled softly, a sound that hadn't cut through the fog the first time. He approached the building. The brick was smoother beneath his fingertips, edges of mortar crisp. The overhead light above the door burned brighter, harsher. Inside, the corridor gleamed more modern, same tile layout but newer grout, brighter paint. The vending machines, too, had changed. Now there were only 2, drinks and snacks. Both took cards, their readers flashing green little screens advertising loyalty points. The third machine was gone, the space where it had stood now occupied by a sturdy metal brochure rack filled with glossy pamphlets for state parks and local attractions. He reached out and pushed a button on the drink machine. It lit up obligingly, displaying prices. A bottled tea rolled forward with the familiar clunk when he fed it a crumpled bill and selected it. He held the cold plastic in his hand for a second, more to reassure himself that something tangible had happened than out of thirst. In the restroom, the fixtures were newer. Automatic faucets, sensor-flush toilets. A small, framed notice on the wall thanked visitors for helping keep the facility clean. The font of the State Department name at the bottom matched the one from his current registration form, not the older logo he'd glimpsed outside. He washed his hands, dried them under a blower that roared with unnecessary vigor. In the mirror, his own face looked as it always did at this hour on a long haul. Faint circles under the eyes, stubble shading his jaw, hair flattened from the headset. Nothing strange there. But when he stepped back outside, the rest area's emptiness had gained a new weight. The fog swirled differently, patterns in it that almost suggested movement, like people walking loops he could not see. The pines' branches shifted without breeze. On the far side of the loop, under the halo of the street lamp, he thought he saw, for a heartbeat, the silhouette of another rig. Just a darker rectangle in the white, a hint of corner lights, the glint of a chrome bumper. He blinked. The space was blank again. His watch advanced dutifully as minutes passed. The dash clock did not. Always, when he returned to the cab, it read 12:31, the colon between the numbers blinking steadily as if to insist time was, in fact, moving, a heartbeat in plastic segments. He made a choice the second time he eased down the ramp and merged back onto the highway. He turned the dash clock's brightness down until it was a faint ghost of blue in his peripheral vision. He set the GPS's voice guidance to mute. He let the narrow world of fog and lane line take most of his attention. The sign reappeared, Rest Area 5 MILES. His fingers flexed on the wheel. "No," he said softly to no one, "not this time." He drove on. The fog did not relent. It coiled more thickly in places, thinning only slightly in others. His own headlights bounced back at him in a white glare whenever he caught a patch too dense. The CB, when he flicked it on in a moment of anxious hope, hissed for a few seconds, then caught a fragment of voice that sounded as though it had traveled a long way through bad weather. "You'll just keep on finding it, son, till you stop trying to outrun it," an old man's drawl said, crackling and nearly lost in static. Caleb froze for a beat, then thumbed the mic. "Say again." Only white noise answered. Rest Area 1 mile appeared ahead, its arrow unwavering. His hands ached from gripping the wheel. Fatigue lay under his skin like a weighted blanket. The idea of pushing on, skipping the exit, filled him with an odd, hollow dread, less about missing whatever might be wrong here, more about condemning himself to a stretch of fog that might never end. He signaled. He took the ramp. The rest area emerged once more. The loop, the pines, the building, the lamp. But now the pines were saplings, thin and spindly, their crowns sparse. The building's brick was clean, mortar bright, the edges sharp as if they'd barely had time to accumulate grime. The sign by the door bore the state seal in a style he hadn't seen since childhood photos. The vending machines were gone. In their place stood a single metal drink machine with a row of mechanical levers, its paint bright, its brand logo one that had been rebranded years ago. 3 trucks sat in the lot, their outlines boxier and shorter than most on the road now. One had its hood open, a man in a quilted jacket bent over the engine bay. Another bore a logo of a grocery chain that had folded before Caleb had gotten his CDL. He parked, slower this time, heart beating an odd rhythm. When he cut the engine, the surrounding quiet was different, filled with the ticking of older metal, the muted murmur of distant conversation, the clink of a thermos against a bumper. He stepped out into air that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and gasoline under the omnipresent damp. The fog hung heavier lower, but in the light of the street lamp he could see it eddying around the trucks, rolling off in small curls. The man at the open hood glanced over. He was in his 50s, beard shot through with gray, a logoed cap shaded his eyes. A cigarette glowed between two fingers, its ember a small, angry point in the white. "Fog got you too," he called, voice threaded with the slow cadence of an older time. "She'll play tricks on you if you let her. Loop you past the same patch of pavement till you can't tell your last mile from your next." Caleb approached slowly, boots absorbing some of the damp that had gathered on the asphalt. "I keep hitting this place," he said. "Same rest area. Feels like I'm chewing the same mile over and over." The man chuckled, not unkindly. "Route 47 drift," he said. "Old-timers used to talk about it. All the lonely nights and missed calls and pushed logbooks soak into a road after a while. Some foggy nights they bubble up. You can ride it like a current if you're stubborn." He took a drag, exhaled a thin stream that vanished into the larger white. "Or you can pull off and let it spit you out where you're supposed to be." The statement was absurd, and yet his tone was matter-of-fact, as if discussing axle ratios or fuel prices. Caleb's rational mind stuttered, trying to slot the words into its frameworks. "How long you been here?" he asked. The man shrugged. "Long enough to know the coffee in that building never really gets cold." He jerked his chin toward the brick structure, long enough to see a few different paint jobs on that door. Another driver stepped out of the building then, younger, wearing a jacket Caleb recognized as the style from a decade ago, not two. He nodded in passing, eyes tired but not surprised to see someone standing in the fog talking to a stranger. Something loosened in Caleb's chest. An odd, exhausted laughter bubbled up, barely making it past his lips. "So what, I just stay?" "For a while," the older man said. "Sit, sleep. Let the fog and the road and whatever this is sort themselves out without you trying to make time behave. When you're ready and when it's ready, you roll out and you're past it." "And if I do?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. The man's gaze went to the swirling mist just beyond the pool of light. For a second, his eyes seemed older than his face. "Then you keep seeing these pines and this brick from every angle there ever was," he said quietly. "Honestly, I wouldn't recommend it. The coffee's not that good." Caleb stood there, the fog beating on his eyelashes, his jacket gradually soaking up the damp. His logbook, resting open on the passenger seat in the cab, would not like this. His dispatcher, waiting for a load to ping delivered in the morning, would not like this. Leela's crayon drawing on the fridge in his apartment, with its stick-figure dad and giant, smiling son, might not mind. He looked over his shoulder at his truck. The box loomed in the mist, mute and patient. The outline of the cab was familiar, the way the side mirror jutted, the angle of the steps. This was his world, and right now that world had folded back on itself like a page. He made another choice. He climbed back into the cab, shut the door, and instead of turning the key, he reached for the bunk curtain. The sleeper behind him smelled like his own laundry, his own shampoo, the cheap pine of the little clip-on air freshener he'd stuck to the vent weeks ago. Familiar, lived-in scents anchored him. He kicked off his boots, lay down fully dressed, and pulled the blanket over himself. Outside, the fog pressed against the small window, reducing the world to a soft, featureless glow. The truck rocked faintly now and then as heavier eddies of mist brushed it. His last sight, before his eyelids slid closed, was the faint blur of the dash clock through the curtain gap, still reading 12:31 a.m., the colon ticking steadily. He slept. Dreams, if they came, were soft and shapeless, hints of pines and road lines and voices on the CB that blended together without urgency. The kind of sleep that caught up on accumulated deficits in one long, slow avalanche. When he woke, light pressed against the sleeper curtain from the other side. Not the electric sodium of a street lamp, but the pale, diffused brightness of day filtered through overcast and fog. He sat up joint stiff, checking his watch almost before his feet hit the floor. 7:12 a.m. The cab felt different in the way occupied spaces do after a long, restful night. Air slightly warmer from his breath, surfaces faintly less sterile. He pulled the curtain aside. Outside, the fog still lay over the rest area, but thinner now, its body more gauze than wall. Trees emerged beyond the lot, their trunks clearer, their branches etched. The rest area itself had settled into yet another version of itself. The building wore the design he vaguely remembered from only a few years back, updated signage, but still the same basic brick shell. The pines in the median had a medium thickness, not saplings, not fully mature. A mix of vehicles dotted the lot, a minivan, a later model rig, a state dot pickup with a reflective stripe down the side. No boxy older trucks, no vending machine with levers, no man with a quilted jacket and a cigarette. His dash clock now read 7:12 a.m. as well, the numbers finally in harmony with his watch. The GPS, when he glanced at it, had plotted his position as 22 miles past where it had last remembered him, the blue arrow sitting near a different icon. Rest area, East Valley. He stepped out into air that smelled of wet dirt, coffee drifting faintly from the open doors of the building, and something else, a sort of quiet that felt less like an absence and more like a truce. At the far end of the lot, a small memorial stood where a strip of lawn met the tree line. He hadn't noticed it in the night. A simple stone, waist-high, with a bronze plaque. Curious, he walked over, boots leaving damp prints on the concrete. The plaque read, "In memory of those who lost their lives in the fog-related collision on Route 47, October 12, 1993. Drive RESTED, drive alert. This rest area is here to help you arrive." Caleb traced the engraved letters lightly with one finger. The date sat there, small but stubborn. He had been a child in '93, too young to remember the news beyond perhaps a brief fragment on a television in his parents' living room. A soft scrape of shoes on concrete made him turn. A woman in a safety vest stood a few feet away, a thermos in one hand, clipboard in the other. State logo on her jacket, hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. "Morning," she said. Her gaze followed his to the plaque. Fog got bad on that stretch back then. They put this rest area in afterward. People kept pushing on when they should have stopped. "Does it happen a lot?" Caleb asked. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, like it had been left somewhere else and just caught up. "Rex," she shrugged. "Less than it used to with the signs and the alerts. People still try their luck, though, think they can outrun the white." She took a sip from her thermos, regarding him more closely. "You look like you used yours the right way." He thought of the loops, the shifting versions of the same spot. He thought of the old man with the cigarette, the younger driver from 10 years ago, the vending machines that morphed. Of the dash clock, holding its breath at 12:31 until he'd finally decided to stop. "Yeah," he said softly, "I guess I did." Back on the highway later that morning, the fog pulled back, curling into the low places and leaving the road clearer. The pines thinned, giving way to rolling fields stitched with fence lines. Traffic picked up, farm trucks, service vans, the occasional RV. Route 47 felt like just another road again. Mile markers appeared and disappeared in predictable order. The GPS moved his little arrow along without drama. The dash clock, now apparently reconciled with the passage of time, advanced its minutes obediently. He kept his eye out for the first rest area 5 miles sign after East Valley, half expecting to see it and feel the same subtle hitch in his chest. It never showed. The highway shoulders remained unbroken, except for the usual gravel turnouts and gated service lanes. At a fuel stop that afternoon, with sunshine finally breaking through thinning clouds, He mentioned the looping rest area to a fellow driver he'd known in passing for years. The older man listened, expression somewhere between interested and non-committal. "Yeah, I heard stories about that stretch," he said eventually, wiping his hands on a rag. "Guys say the fog there'll walk you past your own tail if you let it. Never hit it myself. Maybe I was never tired enough. Or maybe I just didn't tune into whatever station you got last night." He eyed Caleb for a second, then added, quieter, "Either way, you pulled off. That's the part that matters." That night, parked at a crowded truck stop 100 miles away, Caleb lay in his bunk and listened to the muted symphony of idling engines around him. No fog pressed against the windows here. Sodium lights washed the lot in flat, unwavering brightness. Still, when he closed his eyes, he could see the slight sway of pines in mist, the glow of a lonely street lamp, and the unblinking numbers 12, 31 hovering on his dash like a held breath. He didn't know what exactly he'd driven through on Route 47, a quirk of weather and fatigue, a stretch of road haunted not by ghosts in sheets, but by the collective weight of all the night's drivers had stayed awake alone when they shouldn't have. A loop the world offered once in a while, not to trap him, but to give him a chance to choose differently. Whatever it was, the next time fog began to rise from ditches like breath and the world narrowed to the space directly ahead, he knew he would read the Rest Area 5 MILES sign with a different kind of respect. He would see not just concrete and brick and flickering lights, but all the versions of himself who might or might not decide to pull in. And somewhere out there on Route 47, thick in the white where pines crowd close and the clock hesitates, a little loop of pavement would wait, ready to appear as many times as it took until someone finally parked, killed the engine, and let the night and the fog move past without them. Story number 6. On maps, the 10-mile stretch of Interstate 92 that crossed the Marshfield Basin was nothing special, a straight, even line floating across a wide smear of blue and green. To dispatchers, it was a convenient shortcut between two busier corridors. To locals, it was the place where fog developed a personality. By the time Nadia Singh reached the first low causeway pillar, the marsh had already begun breathing its white breath up into the night. Her rig, an aging, well-kept Volvo hauling a refrigerated trailer full of produce, rolled forward on a ribbon of concrete that hovered just high enough above the flooded grasses to feel like a bridge and just low enough to feel almost level with the water. The day had been hot. Heat had soaked into asphalt and concrete and oil pans, had steamed in shimmers above the pavement. Now, with the sun long drowned and the air cooling in slow degrees, that heat met the basin's damp and turned into fog. It started low, a faint pearly shimmer clinging to the ditches and the shallow pools that mirrored the pale sky. Her headlights caught it and turned it into floating gauze that wrapped briefly around the truck's tires before dissolving. Crickets sang in high, manic threads from the reeds. Somewhere out in the darkness, frogs answered, their calls a slow, hollow percussion. Inside the cab, the world was warmer and more contained. The soft glow of the dash painted her hands in greenish light where they rested, relaxed but ready, at 10 and 2. The air vents exhaled a gentle stream of just cool air that smelled faintly of plastic, and the citrus clip-on freshener she'd picked up at a truck stop a few states back. Her travel mug, empty now but still carrying the ghost of coffee and cheap creamer, sat snug in its holder. The overhead console showed the time, 3:02. The lane around her was nearly empty. A set of taillights had lingered ahead an hour earlier, then peeled off toward a coastal town. Since then, it had been only her, the road, and the marsh. On the CB, Channel 19 was a low murmur of distant conversations, most of them from other roads, other states. Someone talked about a scale house open 200 miles west. Someone else told a story about a stubborn dispatcher and a missed birthday. Their voices rose and fell in static like driftwood washing in and out with a tide. She thumbed the mic, more to feel it in her hand than out of real expectation. "Any westbound on 92 crossin' the basin?" she asked. "Fog sittin' up yet, or is it just gettin' started?" There was a pause, then a faint, Midwestern drawl bled through. "It'll build on you round marker 18, ma'am," the unseen driver said. "Gets real snug out there by the flats. Be seein' only what's right in front of you." She glanced at the green marker that appeared at the shoulder and slipped away in her high beams. 13. 5 miles to 18. Plenty of room. The first overhead sign loomed ahead a few minutes later, a big, rectangular electronic message board suspended on a braced metal frame. In clear weather, its amber LEDs flashed congestion updates, amber alerts, cheerful seat belt reminders. Tonight, its face was mostly dark. As her truck approached, a line of text kindled across it, amber characters rising out of black. "Fog ahead. Reduce speed." The fog she could see from her windshield didn't seem that bad yet, but she eased off the throttle anyway. The engine's hum slid down half a note. Her speedometer fell from 65 to 55, then hovered. "Copy that," she murmured to no one in particular. Within another mile, the marsh had exhaled fully. Fog rose in soft waves off the water, curling through the guardrails and spilling across the pavement. It was not yet a wall, but it was a thick carpet, rising to the truck's bumper, then hood, then windshield. The reeds and scrubby trees that lined the channels became pale suggestions. Headlights shortened, their cones of light bouncing back more brightly. She clicked on her fog lights, the low, wide beams turning the suspended droplets into a swirling universe of points. The world beyond the hood shrank to a tunnel. Above, the underbelly of the fog glowed faintly, catching and holding her own light. She checked her mirrors. The red position lights on the trailer glowed in soft halos, edges blurred. Beyond them, the night was a uniform silver, distance erased. Marker 16 slipped by. She could taste the damp in the air now, a cool tang that carried a faint hint of salt and decaying vegetation. Her hairline prickled under her cap where tiny mist droplets edged in along her scalp. The CB hissed, then stuttered into static. The driver who'd warned her before was either out of range or swallowed by the same white she now drove through. Up ahead, another overhead gantry emerged from the fog like the ribs of a whale. The message board there was already lit. "Dense fog. Next 8 miles. Use caution." She nodded slightly. "Using it," she murmured. Her own voice sounded closer in this fog-wrapped cab, as if the damp had crept through the glass and closed the space around her. As she passed beneath, the sign flickered. For a split second, the official warning dissolved into a jumble of pixels, then reformed into a different message, one not written in the uniform, all-caps style of dot advisories. "NADIA. Slow down." Her hands tightened on the wheel before she could think. Instinctively, her foot lifted, the truck's momentum bleeding away. Her gaze snapped between the road and the rear view, as if expecting some camera or prankster to reveal themselves. No one was there, just the white, tumbling world, rails and water and reeds erased. Her heart gave one hard, cold thump, then steadied. She swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "Nadia," she repeated quietly, tasting the sound of her own name in the humid air. It wasn't a common name on the road. It wasn't something a generic system would be programmed to display. She flicked her eyes to the little transponder puck on her windshield, to the GPS on the dash. Both devices knew who she was, in lines of text and account numbers. Neither should have had any way to feed a name into a state-run message board. The rational part of her mind lined up possible explanations. Software glitch, someone testing the system, a maintenance worker playing, and none of them fit smoothly. The truck continued forward. Fog wrapped around the cab, stroked the trailer's sides, slid in under the bumper. The pavement ahead was a narrow river of gray, its edges only hints. The reflectors along the center line glowed like small, regular ghosts. Marker 18 appeared and was gone, its numbers smeared by mist. She wrapped her fingers more firmly around the wheel, feeling the texture of the worn leather, the smoothness where other hands had held it through other dark miles. Her breathing slowed by conscious intent. Up ahead, another gantry waited, its silhouette barely darker than the fog. "All right," she said softly, "let's see what you've got this time." This board, too, lit as she approached, the amber LEDs kindling from the edges inward. The characters marched across in neat lines. Right lane closed. 3 miles ahead. Merge left. She frowned. She hadn't heard anything on the radio about lane closures on 92 tonight. No construction planned. No accidents listed on her company's route checks. Still, warnings like this didn't appear without some reason. She clicked on her blinker, the faint tick of metronome inside the quiet cab, and slid gradually into the left lane. The road felt subtly different here, elevation shifting a fraction, maybe an expansion joint sitting slightly skewed. Nothing dramatic, nothing wrong, just new. The fog thickened again, if that were possible, droplets clustering more tightly, their movement slowing. Her headlights' range reduced to a mere car length. Shapes beyond that distance lost even the suggestion of edges. Her fingertips registered every vibration from the road, every tiny tug on the steering column. Around her, the marsh had become an absent thing. She could not see water or vegetation or horizon, only the insistent white. The internal clock in her body suggested 5 minutes had passed. Her dashboard clock, steady and unconcerned, rolled from 3:08 to 3:13. No cones appeared, no reflective barriers or arrow boards, no flares, just fog and concrete and guardrail. A shape began to smear itself into her forward view, darker gray in the gray, something large and unmoving. Her foot slid to the brake without fully leaving the accelerator ready. The closer she came, the more detail resolved. A tractor trailer jackknifed across the right lane and part of the shoulder, nose almost brushing the guardrail. Its hazard lights blinked feebly, their red pulses muffled by fog. A faint triangle of fallen flare lay on the ground, its ember weak. No one moved around it. No emergency strobes cut the white. The scene had that eerie, just occurred stillness, where the world had not yet sprung into processing mode. She eased past in the left lane, giving as much berth as the guardrail allowed. As she drew even with the cab, she caught a glimpse of a face in the driver's window, someone on a cell phone, eyes startled, mouth pulled tight. He looked up at her for half a second with an expression that was as much disbelief as gratitude. She tapped her air horn once, a low, brief note, then rolled on, the fog reclaiming the sight behind her almost immediately. "Okay," she exhaled, "okay." Her palms left faint, damp spots on the wheel when she shifted her grip. The next overhead sign did not wait long. The framework appeared ghost-like, then solidified. The message board, at first blank, burst suddenly into light as her truck entered its range. Rest area 2 miles. Open. Then a heartbeat later, beneath it, new text flickered in, crowding the usual format. Pull in. Check your tires. She almost laughed, the sound more a release of tension than amusement. "You're chatty tonight," she said under her breath. The memory of the jackknifed truck behind her, half invisible until she was nearly on it, sat heavy in her mind. If a tire of hers was failing, if heat or unseen damage were hiding under a layer of tread, the fog would hide any early smoke until it was something worse. She felt for the truck through the pedals and the seat, looking for any offbeat thump, any waggle that betrayed a problem. Everything felt normal. The gauges all sat where they should. The trailer pulled straight. But the idea of a lit, structured space ahead, a rest area with its concrete and lights and perhaps the presence of other human beings, however briefly encountered, grew very appealing. She signaled right, the click measured and calm, and took the exit. The rest area lay low and close to the marsh, A shallow, looping drive flanked by scrub bushes and dwarf trees. Fog pooled there, too, drawn to the slight dip. Sodium floodlights on tall poles threw a soft, pollen-colored glow over the lot, their beams flattened and diffused by the air. A few vehicles occupied the spaces. 2 pickups, a sedan, a single other semi faced the opposite direction, its curtains drawn. Their forms loomed, half-eaten by mist. She parked in a slot near one of the light poles, set her brakes, and let the engine idle down for a moment before shutting it off. The sudden quiet felt like slipping underwater. Outside, the fog pressed thickly against the windshield. When she opened the door, cool, damp air poured in, smelling of wet concrete, distant brackish water, and the faint sour tang of discarded coffee. Her boots met the ground with a gentle, hollow sound, as if the fog had softened the pavement's solidity. She circled the rig hand running along the trailer's flank, listening, feeling. The tires stood in their neat rows, sidewalls beaded with moisture, treads dark and solid. No heat shimmered from them, no smell of burning rubber slipped through the fog's chilled scent. The rest area itself was quiet. The restroom building squatted near the center, its windows rectangles of pale light. A vending machine humming faintly inside cast moving shadows on the tile. Occasional footsteps echoed from within, then faded. She paused halfway around the truck, listening. Cars whispered past on the interstate beyond the low embankment, their progress marked only by the faint change in fog glow and sound. A distant truck horn blew once, long and low. Above the muffled world, the overhead message board on the highway, this one near the rest area entrance ramp, glowed faintly through the fog. She could just make out the rectangle of it, amber light leaking into the mist like a backlit sheet. From where she stood, its text was unreadable, just a shimmer of pixels. She realized with a small start that she wanted to know what it said when she wasn't there to trigger it. She wiped her hand dry on her jeans, finished her walk around, then climbed back into the cab. Inside, everything felt reassuringly close and normal. Gauges, switches, the slight scuff on the dash from where she'd once dropped a toolbox. She turned the key to auxiliary power. The dash lights hummed to life. The clock read 3:31 a.m., the CB whispered. On a small impulse, she killed the cab lights, leaving only the glow of her instruments. The rest area's sodium lamp washed weakly through the glass. Through the fog, she could see the faint, smudged rectangle of the overhead sign on the mainline road. Tiny pinpricks of amber flickered at its surface. As she watched, the pattern of those pinpricks shifted, coalescing into legible letters, even at this distance, as if the fog were magnifying them somehow. Stay PUT. 5 MINUTES. She felt it then, that curious sensation of being noticed, of being, somehow, part of something's field of awareness. It wasn't menacing. If anything, it was oddly attentive, like the way a good dispatcher remembered who was on break and who was still waiting for a door. 5 minutes. She checked the clock at steady digits. 3:31. She could fire up and leave right now. Slide back onto the interstate, keep her schedule, trust her own hands and timing and years of experience. Instead, she sat back in the seat, let her fingers fall away from the key, and simply listened. The truck creaked softly as it settled on its suspension. The reefer unit in the trailer clicked on, hummed, and clicked off again. The fog rubbed itself gently against the cab, a constant, faint white noise. Her shoulders loosened incrementally. Her eyelids felt the weight that came from focusing too long on a narrow stretch of road. Out of habit, she reached to the side and pulled the logbook from its pocket. 5 minutes was nothing on those lines. A brief, almost invisible pause between longer blocks of motion. At 3:36, the dash clock changed from 3:35 to 3:36 with its usual unbothered smoothness. Headlights flared on the fogged glass of her windshield, glaring for a second. A truck roared past on the main line, much too fast for the conditions, the Doppler of its engine sound rising and falling in a breath. Through the veil of trees and mist, she saw only its lights, brilliant, white, and slightly wobbling. A second later, harsh red washed the fog as brakes came on hard. The faint squeal reached her ears, dulled by distance and damp, followed by the distorted shape of motion, trailer beginning to swing, then catching, then righting. For a heartbeat, everything in her went still. There was no sickening crunch, no explosion of twisted metal noises, just the sound of mass and friction and course corrected at the last possible second. Then the roar receded, the truck, whoever's it was, continuing its reckless journey wrapped in a narrow personal cocoon of visibility. The fog, its momentary bruising of red gone, closed the gap. The overhead sign's pale nest of pixels flickered. New text formed, brief and simple. All clear. On the CB, somebody's voice crackled in faintly. That was close, a man muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Thought I was gonna kiss that guardrail. Fog's ugly out here tonight. Nadia exhaled. The breath seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs. Yeah, she said softly, though her mic was off. Yeah, it is. She waited another minute, two. The overhead board returned to its generic advisory. Fog ahead, use caution. Her dash clock rolled obediently to 3:38. When she pulled out of the rest area, the fog met her at the ramp, folding around the nose of the truck like it had simply been waiting for her to move again. The overhead sign she'd been watching now faced her directly as she merged. Its amber letters adjusted with a small, visible flicker. Good to Geo. Drive safe. She almost smiled, almost. The rest of Marshfield Basin lay ahead, a soft, attenuated tunnel. Markers 19 through 23 came and went. The fog shifted and thinned in places, thickened in others, but never quite dissolved. Once or twice more, she passed beneath overhead boards. They showed only standard phrases then. Speed limit 55, fog conditions, keep lights ON. Her name did not appear again, nor did any oddly specific commands. By the time she reached firm ground, and the marsh fell away to low. Rolling fields, the sky had started its slow, colorless brightening. The fog lifted in shredded veils, clinging only in hollows and drainage ditches. Early birdsong began, tentative threads stitching themselves into the quiet. At a fuel stop an hour later, where sunshine was already pushing at the edges of the cloud cover, she mentioned, almost offhand, the personal message on the sign to the clerk as he rang up her coffee. He snorted, shook his head. Those boards out on 92, he said. They're glitchy as all get out. Half of them haven't worked right since the flood took out the old control shed. They're supposed to be on some central system in the city now, but honestly, I don't think anyone's paying enough attention to be writing you love notes in the fog. A driver at the next register, gray-haired, sun-creased, chuckled. Marshfield signs got their own mind, he said. Had one tell me to check SDRAPS couple winters back when I thought I was all tight. Pulled off, walked round, sure enough one of the winches had walked itself half loose. Maybe it's just the tech having a bad day. Maybe it's all the things we forget to notice, piling up in the wires. It could have been bad wiring, or a worn relay, or some bored employee in a control room somewhere, trawling through connected data and sending little nudges into the night. Or it could have been something else. Something older than the electronics, using newer bones. A stretch of road and marsh that had seen enough nights of fog and almost wrecks and drivers pushing just a bit too far, reaching out in the only language it had available. Back on the road, with the basin behind her and the day beginning in earnest, the overhead signs she passed were bland and generic, their messages impersonal. Construction ahead. Click it or ticket. She still found her gaze drawn upward each time she approached one. A small part of her reading the rows of amber squares like someone, scanning the horizon for familiar lights. She never saw her name on them again. She never again received a directive quite so pointed as stay PUT5 MINUTES. But on certain nights, when fog rose from low ground and the world shrank to what lay immediately in front of her bumper, she drove a little slower. She paid more attention to the odd little hunches that said, "Stop now. Check that. Take this next exit and breathe." And somewhere out over the Marshfield Basin, in air that remembered every light that had ever shone through it and every voice that had ever called out across its white, amber pixels slept behind blank screens, ready to wake briefly, now and then, with a message meant only for whoever happened to be there to see it.